Carol and I have been married for 16 mostly wonderful years. We have a lovely 14-year-old daughter named Jenny. Initially, we wanted another child, but Carol went on the pill right away and we both got involved with our jobs. We were so happy with Jenny that eventually we felt we didn't need another child. I love my family so much and thought we had created a loving marriage and a close relationship. I've always felt lucky to have an intelligent, attractive wife, but sometimes I wonder if having such a pretty wife would lead to some difficulty. I was always amazed and delighted that such a beautiful woman decided to marry an average-looking stiff like me. Whenever I brought this up, Carol would laugh. I guess I just felt sorry for you. Mark, you looked so dejected when I met you that first time. I just had to cheer you up. She'd say, well, you sure did a great job at that. I reply, smiling. After I met you, I've never felt dejected again. I love you. I love you too. Mark. That teasing banter always got a big laugh from both of us. But lately I've been thinking seriously about her answer. She was correct. I was depressed when Carol and I first met. I had just broken up with my one-time girlfriend from college. Yeah, I was dumped. I cared for her a lot when she wanted to break up. I was very down in the dumps. We had been together for 3 years, and the breakup hit me hard. I found out later she met another guy from her hometown and wanted to pursue a relationship with him. There was no cheating involved. She always said she had fun with me when we were together, but she was soon leaving the area to return home and didn't want to maintain a long-distance relationship. In fact, she had met this guy a couple of months before during a break in her classes. She said they hadn't had sex, but she was interested and decided to break up before cheating on me. I guess I respected her for being honest, although it still hurt. Before I met Carol, I finished college with an accounting degree, got a job right away, and started my career as a single man. I dated a few girls, but never met anyone who really cared for my sex life. Was infrequent. None of the women from work turned me on. I partied with some friends after work, but my career was my life, and in a couple of years I was making pretty good money. It was by chance that I met my future wife. I was invited to a friend's house for a party. My friend Jim Simpson, whom I've known since my college partying days, and his wife Martha, kept trying to set me up a few times with some eligible females. It was at one of these house parties that I met Carol. She was introduced to me at the party, and we hit it off. Carol's a tall, vivacious, natural blonde with a pretty face and a slender but shapely figure. Jim pointed her out and said she, like me, had broken up with her boyfriend and was available. She was so pretty that I found it hard to believe why any guy in his right mind would break up with such a beautiful woman like her. Carol was pleasant and told me she's an art major and was graduating soon. She was not only beautiful and intelligent, but funny, outgoing, and very easy to talk to. We ended up chatting for most of the party. She agreed to meet me the next weekend, and we began dating soon. We had sex and became an item. Not long afterward. We were a couple at first. Carol made it clear she was still dating other guys, but after a few months, we became exclusive. At least I was. It took her a little longer before I knew she had only eyes for me. I was already a CPA when I met Carol and established in my career. I think the fact that I was making good money, who could afford to take Carol to places her previous boyfriends never could, was a big factor in her decision to marry me. I know being financially stable was important to her, and when I showed her my new home, my sports car, and took her to nice restaurants, she was impressed. I'd like to think it was my good looks and charm that attracted her, but being honest, I knew that I was only average-looking and kind of reserved, certainly not a stud. I believe she enjoyed our lovemaking. I know I did. I found out she was a lot more sexually experienced than I, and had dated a lot of guys before me. In my mind, once we were married, it was forever, and those guys were history. She told me they were in her past, that she loved me and only me. I accepted her answer completely, and not long afterward, I asked her to marry me. When she said yes, it was the happiest day of my life. Jim Simpson had been a friend of mine for years. We played on a few sports teams and partied together. We lived in the same town and met up regularly to drink and hang out. Jim was married at the time, but when his marriage to Martha began to fail, I tried to help him get over his divorce. I found out later that he had been cheating on Martha, and she found out about it. She hired a shark of a lawyer and took my best friend to the cleaners. Jim's a handsome guy, loud and bigger than me. Once he was single, we went out together and I could see that women were attracted to him. He dated some really sexy chicks, even bringing them over to our house for parties and dinners. None of his relationships lasted longer than a few months. Carol and I talked about his problems, and she was the one who pushed me to keep inviting him over to our house. She kept telling me that Jim was down in the dumps about his life and needed our support, but that didn't seem to fit because I knew for a fact that he didn't need any help to get dates. Carol was insistent that we remain good friends and help him get over the bad memories of his divorce. I often told Carol she didn't need to worry about him so much. I didn't want to unfairly characterize my friend, so I never mentioned that he was a liar, a cheater, and probably deserved the divorce. I brought up that Jim was a good-looking single guy with a well-paying job and told her how women seemed to flock to him everywhere we went. She disagreed. Carol said he just hid his depression about his failed marriage, that he was our friend and we couldn't let him down. I guess that just went along with her opinion and kept up our friendship. He was my best friend for years, and the truth is, I was happy to have him around. That was the situation for a number of years. However, in the last few months, things began to change as usual. Jim came around quite often and hasn't been the case for some time. Carol increasingly kept bringing up his supposedly fragile emotional condition. It was strange because Jim didn't seem depressed at all, but she'd been like this for so long I considered it a normal topic of conversation. However, when things grew even stranger around her house, I became suspicious. I was working harder than ever as an accountant, but over the last couple of years my career had stagnated. I hadn't gotten the promotion I deserved. I still had a number of important clients and was still making decent money, and I was still providing Carol and Jenny with a good living. Carol was also working part-time in an art studio, making a small income, so our finances, while not improving too much, were still on solid footing. The problem was that after 10 years at my firm, I wasn't making the money I thought I should. Considering the long hours I had to put in, I hoped for another raise to make up the shortfall. But when the economy took a downturn, upper management decided to have a series of layoffs. I kept my job, but my salary was cut. Luckily, Carol was still working in her lifestyle at the time, was pretty conservative. The problem arose when I told my wife we'd have to cut our expenses. When I informed her that we'd have to cancel our annual vacation, she was shocked. I explained the situation and told her that in addition to cutting her vacation, we have to cut back on a few other luxuries, such as going out so often. At the time, we usually went out every weekend to dinner, dancing, or to a show. Carol didn't understand why, after working so many years, our finances were in such a bad state. I went on to explain to my dubious spouse that my income had dropped, and my prospects for promotion in the short term were not good. Carol had always enjoyed an active social life. She had lots of friends, some of whom were rather snobby. She loved to dress up and enjoyed attending expensive social engagements. In the past, I reluctantly went along with her wishes when she'd accept invitations to some gala, but with my diminished income, the rather large mortgage, the car payments, and my responsibilities to our daughter's education fund, we had to cut back somewhere. Carol was not pleased when I informed her that we could no longer maintain our lucrative lifestyle. She was flabbergasted when I suggested canceling, going to some of the expensive restaurants with her friends. Of course, that conversation led to an argument and eventually a big fight over our future. At first, I didn't think it was unusual when my friend Jim was around during some of these arguments. He was coming over to our house several times a week at the time, so it was inevitable he'd witnessed some of these discussions. It was rather awkward when he seemed to favor Carol's side of the argument. He wasn't obvious about it as Carol and I would discuss our issues. He listened for a bit, then offered an occasional comment which on the surface seemed conciliatory. But when I thought about it later, he seemed to always agree with Carol. When I brought up canceling outings with our friends, Carol turned to Jim and asked how he felt about it. The big guy would have thoughtful, but eventually would agree with Carol. He would reiterate her arguments and even offer to help us out with our finances if needed. I didn't like that answer. He went on to offer to drive, if we wanted to go out somewhere. If Carol and I wanted to go to a club that had a cover charge, Jim even offered to pay whatever fee was required. If we were invited to a party, he'd pay for some sort of gift if necessary, so we wouldn't have to go empty-handed. I thanked him but said, "No thanks. I want to make my wife happy," but I was irritated that he always offered to come to our financial rescue. I knew he could afford to help us out. He had left his previous job and was now working in some sales job, apparently doing quite well. One evening, Carol invited Jim over for dinner without telling me, which happened quite regularly. Now, As usual, she was a great hostess. We enjoyed pleasant conversation as we finished the delicious dinner. Carol cooked. After our daughter left to do her homework, we retired to the living room and opened a bottle of wine. We barely pour our wine and sat down before Carol reminded me of the upcoming annual charity event I'd forgotten about. Although it was something we attended every year, I listened to her telling how many of our friends would be there and how nice the event was. I already knew about this event and also how much it would cost to get in. When I explained that we couldn't afford any sort of party this month, Jim suddenly spoke up. He said he understood my reluctance, but that this event was for charity and it would be a shame not to contribute in some way. Carol eagerly listened to him with a look of delight on her face. When my friend offered to assist us with the cost, Carol was elated. I, however, was pissed. He was well aware of our financial situation and my feelings on the subject. I guess I expected my best friend to support my decision, but that wasn't the case. Carol listened silently to my objections. Then she shot me a glare and glanced over at Jim. They shared a look that immediately raised my suspicions. "Come on, Mark," Jim said pointedly. "You know, this is an annual event and one that we've never missed. It would be a shame not to go over just a few bucks. We've been going for years." I was also disappointed, but I knew that we needed to keep our expenses down so we could afford the large mortgage payment that month. "We just have to go, sweetheart," Carol insisted, patting my hand. "I know it will be a little tight, but everyone we know will be there," Jim chipped in. "You know the guys would love to see you. Mark, I know they're all looking forward to it. It'll be a blast," before I could reply. Carol squealed. "We had so much fun last year. Remember, honey?" I shook my head no, and Carol scowled with a determined glare. She said, "I'm serious. Mark, we have to go, honey. All our friends will be there, and I've already spoken to Mary, and I don't want them to think that we don't contribute to charity. Everyone wants to give to charity. But I was thinking that if we don't get our finances together, we'll be the ones that have to accept charity. It's just not in the budget this year." I told them flat out maybe next year, but it'll be a blast, Jim said, smiling. "Of course it will," Carol said. She pouted and turned to Jim. "But darn it, Mark just doesn't want to go." Jim questioned my decision again. Before I could answer, my wife began to complain about how cheap I was. Nothing she said was a secret. I had been holding back on some of her expenditures. She turned her attention to Jim and listed several times. She couldn't do what she wanted because I refused. "You see, Jim," she said to him, ignoring me. "I'm trying to enjoy a great social life, but Mark's not letting me. He's getting cheap in his old age." Carol made me sound like a disagreeable old man. I tried to reply calmly, but it was difficult. "I'm not cheap, Carol. Just realistic, despite what you think. We're in a bit of a slump. Spending money we don't have is just stupid in our situation. I don't want us to overextend ourselves, but think of all the good that we can contribute, honey." Jim quickly added, "You know, it's a charity event, right?" "Mark, of course I do," I exclaimed in exasperation. "But it's $75 a plate. Then there's the parking fee at the club, and after an expensive dinner that we can't afford, there's... The charity auction will be expected to bid on overpriced items that will never use charity or not. We can't afford it." That led to an acrimonious discussion about my diminished position at work and my reduced salary. Jim already knew some of it, but they were sensitive issues. I wanted to remain private because I was rather embarrassed about it. Carol smelled blood and was really venting, now. She complained openly to Jim about her disappointment with me and frustrations with her lifestyle. I didn't want her to divulge any of that stuff, but it was too late. I admitted we had to cut back expenses to make sure Jim's education was taken care of, and we could make our mortgage payments. I hoped that would put some sense of reality into my wife, but she was unsympathetic. "See what I mean, Carol?" she sneered, gazing hopefully at Jim. "He always comes up with some dumb excuse not to go out." I was pissed these two were openly ganging up on me, countering my arguments and totally dismissing my concerns. Carol was gazing, hopefully at Jim, waiting for him to say something to support her. Jim glanced at her and then looked at me with a sympathetic look. "Well, Mark, why don't I cover you then?" he quickly offered. "I don't want to go by myself, and I have the cash. It would be my pleasure to take you and Carol out to this event. You know, we always have fun. I'd be disappointed if you weren't there. After all, you've been there for me this past year after my divorce, so in a way I'll be paying you back. I'd love to take you both to keep me company. I'll drive and even pay for the babysitter. 2. Really? Carol squealed already. He was coming to her rescue. Oh, gosh, Jim, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. Before I could reject his offer, she ran around the table, hugged the guy, and kissed him, crying repeatedly. Thank you, Jim. Thank you. I was steaming not just about Jim contradicting my decision, but also by Carol's gleeful reaction to his offer. She cared nothing about my opinion and practically threw herself at him, right now. She was gushing openly like he was her savior. I shot Jim a look of disapproval as Carol continued to hug him. Carol squealed, and Jim bashfully accepted her praise while I sat across the table feeling angry and disgusted despite what Carol said. I had no intention of accepting anyone's charity, even if it was from a friend. I was most put off by Carol's exuberant physical response. By now, Jim had his arm around her waist as she kissed his cheek and hugged him warmly in no uncertain terms. I quickly rejected his offer. My pride wouldn't let me accept a handout from anybody. They stopped hugging, and Carol considered me cool. Come on, Mark, Jim said, trying to diffuse the tension. Noticing my dark expression, he told me with a smile, let's just go to that thing and have some fun. We can worry about the money later. No way, damn you! I'm serious about this, Carol declared. Oh, just be quiet. Mark, you can part about this all you want, but we're going, and that's final. We'll see about that. She looked at me like I was crazy. She got a weird look on her face, shook her head, and pulled away from Jim's embrace. Then she trotted to the kitchen, grabbed her cell phone, and called up one of her friends with Carol in the other room. Jim and I sat there in silence. I glared at him across the table as we both heard my wife in the other room, chattering away. He looked a little uncomfortable as Carol chatted gleefully with her friend. Oh, yes, we're going. I told you we would, she cried into the phone. Oh, yeah, I know. Well, not really, but I told you we were going. I know you thought, girl, but I knew Jim would come through for us. He's been such a good friend. No, I don't think so, but you know how we can. Her voice suddenly dropped to a lower volume, so I couldn't hear her anymore. Then Carol peeked into the living room and glanced over at me with a smug look. She spoke quietly into the phone as she headed back into the other room for privacy. After that confrontation, the friendship Jim and I shared was broken. I thought, as my buddy, he would have taken my side. But he didn't seem to be bothered about ignoring me. He tried a few times to explain that he just wanted Carol and me to have a good time, so I should just accept it. In my mind, he had taken sides, and it wasn't with me. A while later, my wife came back into the room with a huge smile on her face. She once again thanked Jim, hugging him and kissing his cheek. It seemed a bit over the top to me, and she didn't seem to want to leave his embrace. I told them again that we're not going, and that was my decision. Jim tried to intervene, and Carol kept hugging him, informing me that she was going and wouldn't hear of it. I kept shaking my head. No, but both Jim and my wife weren't listening. I guess they were determined to use the time before the event to get me to change my mind. Looking back, that argument may have been the beginning of the end of my once happy marriage. The week before, the charity event was frosty in our house. Even our daughter Jenny noticed a deep freeze. She was 14, but she wasn't stupid. She knew about the charity event and knew there was a simmering issue between Carol and me that wasn't being resolved. What's the matter, Dad? She asked. One day, when Carol was out of the room, I know that you and Mom are arguing about something. She wants to accept charity, and I don't want to. Charity? You mean welfare or something? Not exactly, but it might as well be welfare. I told her I wasn't brought up to depend on anyone. It's a matter of pride, darling. Once you start taking money from people, it's hard to stop. I've never accepted charity in my life and don't intend on starting now. It's about that charity event, isn't it? Yes, we simply can't afford it. Jenny, I'm not taking a handout just to put on a big show for our friends. But Mom said it's from Uncle Jimmy, she replied, studying my reaction. He's your friend, isn't he? I'm sure he doesn't think it's charity, just one friend helping another. Is that how your mother sees it? Jenny lowered her eyes. Well, we spoke about it a little. That wasn't any surprise. Carol was pleading her case to get Jenny on her side, behind my back, knowing my clever wife was using my daughter to influence me. Pissed me off. I'm sure your mom has told you all about it, I said, holding my temper. But no matter if it's from a friend or not, it's still charity. I don't want to raise you thinking that we are that hard up. My dad never accepted charity his whole life, and he had more problems than we do. But Dad, it's just a party. It's not like we're accepting cash, you know? And Uncle Jimmy is our friend. I was getting annoyed that she kept referring to Uncle Jimmy. I guess that's how Carol must refer to him when I'm not around. I answered my daughter with a little more anger than I should have. If your Uncle Jimmy, I sneered, accentuating his label was my really friend. He'd keep his big mouth shut, his nose out of my affairs, and leave my family alone. My bitter reply called Jenny off guard, and she drew back, looking scared. Then she ran up to her room and closed her door. I felt bad for speaking so bluntly, but I was sick of hearing about Uncle Jimmy and his gratuities. I needed my family to support my decision. Although it seemed it wasn't the case each day, Carol kept smirking at me. I kept insisting that we weren't going to any charity event with or without Jim's help. Each time we had that discussion, she shot me a dark look, and we had another argument a few days before Carol addressed me with undisguised aggravation. "Listen, Mark," she said, "I don't know why you got your panties in such a bunch about this. You know, we go to this event every year, and I don't intend to miss it this year despite your problems at work. I know we're having a little financial difficulty right now. I get it. But we're certainly not poor, and we still need to keep up appearances. If we don't attend, all my friends will be aware of our problems. They'll be talking about us, about me, and I don't want to hear the gossip about it. Later, Jim has offered to help us out, and if you're the man I thought I married, you will accept it with a smile. So that's it?" I blurted out angrily. "I'm not man enough now. Oh, Mark, will you just stop? Of course you are. Just grow up. And it's all about the gossip, not all about it. But yes, I want our family to look good. And I do want to be considered a valued member of our social group. We've made a lot of friends over the years, and I want to go have an enjoyable evening with them. Don't you want to be seen with me? That's not fair. And you know it. Of course I want to be seen with you. I love you and always have. But this argument has gotten me quite pissed off. I thought you would support your husband as a good wife should and try to understand our situation. I can see that's not the case. So if you want to disrespect me this much, just go without me, you asshole," she cried angrily. "You think I'm not a good wife? That's a bunch of bullshit, and you know it. For 16 years I've taken care of you and Jenny without so much as a complaint. Like what? Damn it." She gazed at me with an icy glare. For a moment she didn't speak. The silence was deafening as I waited her out. "So you're going to the mat on this, are you?" she said bitterly. "I thought I could convince you that it would be good for us to have a night out together. Lord knows that hasn't happened lately. You haven't taken me out on a real date in months, and I'm sick of it. That's why we go out to dinner as a family every week. We also go out dancing on occasion, just not to those posh, expensive joints you're hooked on. I told you, Carol, we can't afford that right now. Once Jenny's education is taken care of, I'm sure things will loosen up." Carol looked like she'd bit into a lemon as she listened to me. She seemed to come to a decision and suddenly calmed down, but the triumphant look on her face was troubling. "So, my dear husband, if you weren't going to give me this one night out, then I guess I'll have to be Jim's date. I'm sure you'll be proud to have me, even if you weren't. And don't think it's going to be a platonic date either. I'm going to give your buddy all the attention that I would have given you, and I know he's going to appreciate it. You." Which I snapped with more anger than I'd felt in a while. "I should have known you had this in your head. Don't let me stop you, then go out with him. But don't think I'll forget the sordid betrayal. And I won't forget Uncle Jim's part in this either." I stormed out of the room and slammed the doors, yelled, "You asshole, I'm going, damn it." Well, that didn't go well at all. As I stomped away, I passed by the living room. Jenny was watching TV. I knew she'd heard the whole argument when she glanced over at me with a frightened look. I wanted to hug and console her, to soothe her fears, but I was too worked up at my stubborn wife to say anything nice. So I just went out onto the patio and sat in a chair, steaming. The day before the charity event found our house bitterly cold. Jim called me a few times during the week to convince me to change my mind. I wasn't having it in the last time. I just hung up on him. Our finances were shaky enough, and we simply had to cut back. I had to face facts to keep our family secure, even if my wife wouldn't. If she wanted to make an issue about this, then she was going to get her wish, the night of the event. I'm sure Carol fixed dinner, but I made it a point to stay away and eat out at some cheap place. That night I got home after Jenny and my wife had finished eating. I mumbled some greeting and Jenny said, "Hi, Dad." Carol didn't speak to me. She simply went into the bedroom and locked the door. As she got ready for her date with Jim to keep me from causing a scene, Carol decided to drive over to Jim's house and leave. From there. When she came downstairs to leave, she made sure to strut around the living room, displaying her sexy attire. If I wasn't pissed off before, I was livid. Now she had on a short, tight aqua dress I'd never seen before. It was shockingly brief and displayed her curves like it was painted onto her slender body. Her long hair was flowing. Her makeup was fixed, and the high heels Shannon made her shapely legs look great. "Where'd you get that dress?" "Don't worry about it. Where did she get the money to buy such an obviously expensive dress?" But she wasn't going to tell me, so I kept quiet. Carol ignored me as she went to where Jenny was sitting in front of the TV, leaned down, and gave our daughter a kiss. "Wow, you look wonderful, Mom. You look like a movie star in that dress." "Thanks, dear." Carol's smile disappeared as she glanced pointedly over at me. She told Jenny loud enough for me to hear, "I know Uncle Jim will think so too. I just wish everybody felt the same way." Of course, that comment was directed at me, and I was furious. Unlike when we went out, Carol never looked this good on any of her dates. But for Uncle Jim, she went all out. I could see this was going to be an issue. I just looked at her with disgust and walked out of the room. I wanted her to know I was angry, and she definitely knew it. "Goodbye, Jenny," Carol said, walking to the door, speaking to my daughter and ignoring me. "I may be out late, honey, so don't wait up." She walked out the door and didn't look back. Jenny saw my dismal look and shot me a look of pure pity, which again pissed me off. I knew she hated being in the middle of this, and I wasn't happy either. Something about my daughter pitying me made me even more angry. I marched to the den and shot off a quick text to my former best friend. I thought we were friends. "Jim, now that you're dating my wife, I know you're just another asshole after tonight. Don't bother contacting me. And don't consider yourself my friend. You're not welcome here ever again. Have a good time with my witch of a wife, you prick." I quickly got one back. "It's not a date, Mark, and you know it. I wanted you to come, but you're too stubborn. I'm just letting Carol have some fun, and then I'll make sure she gets home safe. We'll have to talk later. Please don't be upset with me," I sent back. "Screw you." I didn't hear back. I tried to keep my mind off my wife, but it was impossible. Jenny and I watched TV for a while and tried to converse like nothing was wrong. I don't even know what we watched. She could tell I was upset, to her credit. Jenny spoke kindly to me and tried to make me feel better. I was pleased about that, but it wasn't going to be a good night, and we both knew it. Around 10, Jenny went to bed. It was early for her. The situation was so awkward, I guess she couldn't take the tension. I could hear her talking on her cell phone with somebody when I went to bed. Somehow I managed to sleep, but I was woken up by the noise of the front door closing. I glanced at the clock and saw it was 2:30 in the morning. I could hear voices downstairs and knew it was my wife and my former friend. I rolled out of bed and glanced into the living room. They were still near the front door, and it was clear Carol was sloppy drunk, so drunk and unstable. She was hanging on a Jim's arm for support. Her hair was messed up, her eyes were droopy, and she was swaying and giggling. "Thank you for such a wonderful time tonight, Jimmy." She laughed, slurring her words and hugging in close. She threw her arms around his neck, pressed her lean body against this, and gave him a steamy kiss on the lips. It lasted far longer than was proper, and Carol didn't seem like she wanted it to end. Finally, Jim pulled back and glanced around tentatively. "It was fun, but it's late and you should get to bed now." "Carol, but I don't want to go to bed. Mark might be worried about you." "Screw him," she sneered with a giggle. "He's a wet blanket, and I had so much fun with you tonight. Let's do it again." "Okay." I was at the top of the stairs where they couldn't see me. Jim looked uneasy as he glanced toward the hallway. He knew our bedroom was located there. He couldn't see me, but he was probably wondering if I was listening to them. "Let's not talk about that now," he told her. "Go get a shower, get some sleep, and try to make up with your husband. Screw that asshole." She slurred and again fell into his arms. "Why don't you stay and have a drink with me?" "It's not that late, honey." "No, I don't think that's such a great idea. You know he's upset, right? I showed you his text earlier. He's having a snit, and I don't care. Why don't we go over to the sofa and I'll get you a drink, please?" "No." "Carol, not tonight." "Oh, come on," she murmured and pulled his head down for a kiss. This time, Carol French kissed him for a bit before he pushed her away. Please, Carol, I'm trying to keep us out of trouble. He chuckled. You're making that real hard right now. I was already pissed, but I was dumbfounded when I saw him move between them and clutch his crotch through his trousers. I can tell you're hard and big, too. She giggled merrily. In fact, I've known you were quite big every time we danced together. Come on, don't go yet. Jim was smirking but pulled her hand off his crotch and said, You better stop. Come on, Jim. I can tell you want to. Let's go to the sofa and let me show you how much I appreciate all the attention you showed me tonight. No, I'm serious, Carol, Jim said, looking more worried. I know you're a beautiful woman and I'm horny, sure, but I don't want to cause any more trouble with Mark. We are friends, you know. And you're my friend, too. Mark's asleep and he doesn't give a damn about me. I want you to be my special friend, Jim. Please come and stay for a little while. I couldn't take any more of it. I stepped into the room with a look of hate on my face. Yeah, Jim, I said curtly, startling them both. Why don't you be Carol's special friend, you asshole? Jim and Carol both jumped at my presence. In a sarcastic tone, I continued. Why don't you stay for a little while and screw my cheap drunk wife after such a nice date? I'm sure she'll love that. Jim's eyes widened and his face fell. He pushed my wife away and Carol gazed at me with bloodshot eyes, trying to focus. It took a moment for her to regain her composure and sober up a little. Listen, Mark, Jim started to say. Now you listen. You face. I can see now just how much of a special friend you were to my wife, so just screw her. Take her over to the sofa and give her what she desires. Jim shook his head sadly and turned to leave. Carol cried out in protest, grabbed his arm and pulled him back. Just shut up, Mark. Jim was nice to me all night and he doesn't deserve this. Then give him what he deserves, which I cried. You want his big hard meat, so go for it, you cheating wife. Damn you, asshole. Carol screamed. Her face was as red as a beet. Jim just wanted to crawl into a hole. Listen, Mark, Jim said apologetically. I know you're upset about tonight and all, but we did have a great time and nothing happened. I have your word on that, right, shithead? Yeah, nothing happened. I know this looks bad. Why? Uncle Jim, I have to ask angrily. Why does it look bad? Because my wife is trying to give you a hand job, and maybe more for being so nice, or because she's taking you over to the sofa to enjoy sex. Is that it, Uncle Jim? Jim looked at Carol, then at me. He shook his head and headed for the front door to make his escape. On the way, he said to me, Mel, Mark, listen, I've got to go. He told my drunk wife, I better go now. Carol, I'll help you get your car later if you want. I think he was going to say more, but saw my glare and instead twisted away from Carol's grasp and hustled out the front door as a close behind him. Carol seemed to deflate. She looked drunk and dejected as she stumbled into the kitchen to get some water, probably to sober up. I left her there by herself and trudged back to bed. My marriage was no longer on solid ground. Carol woke up on the sofa. She never made it upstairs. I found her lying there the next morning, sprawled out in a new dress. I tried to hold in my anger as I helped her up to the bedroom and flopped her onto the bed. I didn't undress her and left her lying in that tight, obviously expensive aqua dress. I did take off her high heels and pull the cover over. Carol slept until late afternoon, painfully hungover, and I could understand why. After watching her drunken performance last night, I was angry as hell that she just threw herself at Jim, but decided not to act like it. I wanted to see how she would play it before tipping my hand. I knew our relationship had been off for quite a while. The argument about the charity event was just the latest disagreement. However, it was the biggest argument we had ever had. Carol finally made it up for dinner and looked like she didn't want to speak. I just kept silent, determined to make her bring up her disgusting behavior. She slept in the guest room and the rest of the weekend. We tiptoed around each other. She was so drunk. I'm not sure Carol even remembered much about that night. She's not a drinker, so whatever she consumed that night probably had her nearly blacking out. Saturday morning, I made Jenny me breakfast. She mentioned Carol coming home with Jim and asked what the argument was about. I didn't offer much of an explanation, just that we're still working through the charity event issue. Jenny accepted that vague explanation and left the house early. She told me she was going to go over to a friend's. I told her to call in a few hours to check in. I went to work on Monday, as usual. Carol took a while to recover and didn't go to work until Wednesday. We didn't speak about that night until the middle of the next week. I think it took her that long to clear her head from all the alcohol she drank. She acted embarrassed when she tried to apologize for her behavior. I was still too angry to accept any apology. I let her tell me that she was sorry, then spun around and left her standing there. That pissed her off, but I didn't care anymore. Jim called me a couple of times. I ignored his calls and let them go to voicemail. I listened as he apologized about how that night turned out, and then he wanted to talk about it. He wanted to meet me, but I never responded. I'm sure he wanted to soften the guilt he felt for betraying me. I didn't give a damn about him anymore. As far as I was concerned, our friendship was over. One evening, when I was washing the car, I went inside for something and heard Carol speaking on the phone in the kitchen. She didn't know I was there, so I tried to listen to a conversation. Yes, it was wonderful, she told whoever she was speaking to. I know he's still pissed at me. You think so? Thanks, Mel. Mark didn't get it. It was Jim that bought it for me. Yeah, I know. It cost a fortune. He's such a sweetheart and so handsome. I would've. But Mark woke up as I was trying to get him too. Yeah, I know Mark saw me trying to get him, and yes, I know. Oh, it sure was not only big, but hard too. Real hard. My 3 or 4 wife was talking to one of her girlfriends about Jim's meat. Oh, Mark would have a fit if you knew that. No, you can't tell him. No, I have to keep that quiet. I hope he does. We're trying to figure out when I know, but I have to be careful. Mark doesn't know why he called me. He's been calling me all week. I don't know if I can. Of course I want to. Who wouldn't want to date a guy like Jim? You better not. I'm serious. Okay. I know she chatted a little more, but I'd heard enough. I was almost sure she was going to date my ex-friend. I could hardly believe how much our marriage had crumbled in the last few weeks. I caught Carol on the phone a couple more times whenever I entered the room. She'd either turn away and speak softly, or simply hang up. On the weekend, Jim suddenly showed up at our house in his big SUV. I was in the driveway fiddling with my car when he pulled in front. He got out of his big car and strode up our walk, smiling as if everything was fine. Carol must have known he was coming because the second he got out, she immediately came outside with a weird smile on her face. We hadn't been speaking, so when she approached me and began to speak to me, I was immediately on my guard. Hi, honey. I invited Jim over for dinner. She told me flat out when I started to object. She held up her hand to stop me. Listen, Mark, I know what you're going to say. You're still upset about that night, but I think that you two need to talk. Jim wants to. We need to get over this and get back to being friends again. Jim was a few feet away and smiled as he approached. Hi, Mark, he said good-naturedly and held out his hand. Nice to see you again, buddy. I just stared at that idiot with a cold look, trying to defuse the situation. Carol moved next to me with a sweet smile and slipped her arm around my waist. She whispered, Go on, honey, with a big smile as she tried to coax me forward to shake his hand. I just let it hang there in the air and ignored it. Jim's smile disappeared as he realized the insult and lowered his hand next to me. My wife tried to soften the tense atmosphere. Hi, Jim, she gushed, ignoring my harsh glare. Nice to see you. I'm glad you came over today. I was just telling Mark it was time to clear the air. Screw you, I snapped. Carol was startled. Her bright smile wilted a bit. Please, Mark, Jim said. I know you're still upset, but... Oh, you got that? Did you? I felt my wife's arm tighten around my waist. She snuggled against me, trying to keep me from getting any angrier. Please, honey, Carol purred, pressing my arm against her breast. She tried to kiss my cheek. Don't be mad at him. It's my fault. What happened? Not his. Jim's been your friend for so long, and I know you miss him. He misses you too, right, Jim? That's right, Jim quipped. Come on, Mark. No hard feelings, right, buddy? I shot him a look that could kill, and I twisted out of Carol's grasp. I looked straight into his eyes, wishing I could shoot this creep. In an ominous tone, I asked him, So tell me, buddy, did you have a good time with my wife at the charity event? Well, yeah, of course we did, Carol chirped. We wanted you to come, Mark. It would have been more fun if you were there. Honey, you would have loved it. She hadn't spoken to me in nearly a week, and now she was acting all sweet and innocent. I didn't believe her for a second. Jim gazed back at me tentatively, and I looked right into his eyes. So did you guys dance together? I asked him. Well, yeah. Everyone was dancing, you know, Jim replied. Of course. Carol moved next to me again and slipped her arm around me with a sugary, sweet smile frozen on her face. Of course we danced. Mark, Everyone was dancing and having a great time. Like I said, you would have loved it if you had come." I ignored my wife's irritating chatter and kept my attention on Jim. "So you danced. Did you dance the slow songs? Jim, old buddy, hold Carol in your arms. Feel her tits against your chest." In that skimpy dress she had on his face, twisted into a strange grimace. He was uncomfortable, perplexed by these probing questions. "No, nothing like that, Mark," he replied innocently. Just then, Carol moved next to me again and slipped her arm around me with a sugary, sweet smile frozen on her face. "Of course we danced, Mark. Everyone was dancing and having a great time. Like I said, you." I pushed Carol away so she stood next to Jim and turned my attention to her. "And you, my dear, honest wife," I sneered. "Was it all just some casual, friendly dancing like Jim said? Just two friends engaged in some platonic activity, nothing inappropriate, right?" "Of course not, Mark," she blustered. "I'd never do anything to disrespect you, honey. You know that." I pulled out my cell phone and opened up a picture. A guy I knew was at the event with his wife. At my request, he sent me a few incriminating photos of my wife and Jim. I turned the phone so Carol could see it. It took my wife a moment to realize it was her and Jim dancing close the charity event. Suddenly the blood drained from her face and her eyes bulged out. "So my faithful wife dancing like this with my dear old friend is just some platonic dancing, right, honey?" I snickered sarcastically as she gazed at the phone. Jim moved closer to seeing his face with dark. "Where did you get this?" he asked. It was a side shot of Carol and Jim on the dance floor. Couples were dancing all around them, some glancing with amusement at my wife and my former friend, engaged in an intimate embrace. Jim's taller than me, and he towered over Carol. That didn't stop her from sliding her arms around his neck, pressing her live body against his, and Jim leaning down to kiss her on the lips. It was a still shot, so there was no way to know how long the kiss lasted. But to someone who didn't know them, it was very incriminating. Carol's face blanched as she saw how intimate their embrace was. Not to mention the kiss, I heard Jim gulp. "Oh boy." I flipped to another picture and asked Carol, "My dear, I guess you enjoyed that kiss by how you were gazing up into his eyes." The next shot was closer, with only their upper bodies in view. Jim's hands were placed around her waist, and Carol was gazing up at him with adoration in her eyes. A couple next to them was watching with smiles on their faces. I flipped to another picture, and this one had them sitting in a booth, Jim's arm around her shoulders, his hand hovering over her breast. Carol was leaning against his shoulder, her face turned up to his as if expecting another kiss. The last was a shot of them outside on a patio, hugging, with Carol making no effort to pull away Jim's hand on her bum, this time as she leaned against his tall frame. They weren't kissing, but seemed about to. Both Jim and my wife were stunned at the photos. Jim's face flushed with embarrassment, and he began making choking sounds as if trying to speak. "Who sent them to you?" Carol asked. "What difference does that make?" "Well, I know that looks bad, honey," she mumbled. But it's really not like that at all." "Oh, really, Carol?" I said in disbelief. "It sure looks like my wife and my former friend were having an intimate date, making out, fondling each other, and who knows what else, probably screwing in the parking lot. Something you invited him to do on our sofa. Remember that, you stupid witch?" I gazed straight into Carol's eyes as she lowered hers. "I can't believe you behaved that way in front of people we know. Did you get a nice feel of his big, hard tool, honey? Were you going to screw him when you got home? Or was that the second time you would have gotten lucky that night?" "Mark?" "No way," Jim blurted out. "I know that looks bad and all, but it really wasn't like that at all. No one thought we were a couple. We just had a few too many drinks and were having fun." Carol cut in. "Yes, Mark, it was more my fault than Jim's," she explained, trying to sound reasonable. "I probably had too much to drink and I got a little frisky, but nothing happened." "Honey, only a little kiss and a bit of hugging, probably a little inappropriate, but nothing to worry about. Did you get a good feel of his big meat, Carol?" Her jaw dropped. I heard Jim gulp, and he seemed to slump a bit. "No answer," I said accusingly. I turned to Jim, whose eyes were darting around with guilt all over his face. "Did you buy her that dress, asshole? Don't try to lie, you creep." "Well," he started to say, glancing over Carol. My wife stopped him with a wave and said softly, "Yes, he did. Mark." Her eyes lowered. I needed something nice to wear, and I haven't bought anything new in ages. The dress was a gift from Jim, and I knew you wouldn't like it, so I decided not to tell you. And those hooker heels you had on the ones that made you stand about 5 inches taller and made you look like a cheap $20 escort. Come on, Mark, Jim said with irritation. They're not like that. Carol's flushed face and darting eyes told me all I needed to know. I see exactly how it is you wish, I snapped at her. He basically bought you that night, and you tried to reward him later. You know that's what paid escorts do, don't you? Carol. Shame seemed to wilt her. Her face grew hard and her eyes were blazing. Jim tried to say, "Please, Mark, there's no call for that now." I spun around him and shouted, "You made my wife look bad, and you have the nerve to tell me there's nothing wrong? You're a real creep. I wish you were dead. Both of you." One of our neighbors was watching from the porch. Carol noticed that we had an audience. She blushed and looked embarrassed. "I have nothing more to say to those two," I muttered as I jumped in my car to leave. Jim moved quickly and tried to grab my arm. When he pulled me back, I twisted around and took a swing at him. I missed, and he shoved me to the ground before I could swing again. He could have flattened me with one punch. The guy is taller and bigger than me by at least 40 pounds. Not only bigger, but more muscular and athletic. A physical confrontation would only make me look foolish. I got up and brushed myself off as he held his hands in a defensive manner, trying to calm me down. "As for damaging my wife's reputation," I said, glancing at Carol with disgust. "Well, asshole, you're definitely doing a great job." She was staring at me with a shocked expression. The neighbors on the porch were clearly interested. Now. Another couple from down the street was walking by and watching the argument closely. "You're with him now, aren't you?" I yelled loud enough for our audience to hear. "He paid for your dress, your hooker heels, and your date, so just take him inside and give him what he deserves. We all know that's what you wanted to do that night, right?" I moved toward my car, and this time he didn't interfere. Another neighbor peeked out their door, wondering about all the commotion. Carol was blushing pink as she noticed that we had an even larger audience. Now, one thing I learned about her recently was how important her reputation was to her. This public airing of our differences was probably killing her. "Mark, please stop," she pleaded in a whisper. "Don't go away yet. It's not like that. Let's go inside and talk this out. Yeah, Mark, we really need to clear the air, man." The asshole agreed. I looked at them both like they were a piece of shit on my shoe. "Yeah, I want to finish this," I told him bitterly. "So if you're still here when I get back, I'm going to get my gun and blow you away. You clear about that, Jim?" Jim gazed at me in silence. Carol looked sullen and angry. I spit at their feet, jumped in my car, pulled out of the driveway, and sped off, burning rubber in the process. Our neighborhood would have juicy gossip for months. When I got home that night, Jim was gone. Carol was in bed, and I was smashed to the gills. I had a cab bring me home because I was too drunk to drive, and the bartender wouldn't let me out of the bar with my car keys. I fell onto the sofa and didn't wake up until about noon the next day. I quickly called in sick to work. My boss was pissed, but there was no way I was able to perform, being so hungover. I also took the next day off too because I still wasn't right. I finally woke up and got some food in my stomach that seemed to help. Carol was gone to a part-time job at the art gallery, and Jenny was at school. I guess I was feeling a little guilty about my behavior. I don't know why, though. I still blame Carol and Jim for the problem. When Jenny returned home from school, I apologized for my loud confrontation. She acted like it was no big deal, but I knew she had probably witnessed the whole thing and heard everything I said to her mother and Uncle Jimmy. We spoke about it for a while and then left it alone. I fixed it, and before Carol got home, she wasn't home on time, and Jenny and I ate dinner without her. I was still pissed, but my hangover softened my anger a bit. When my wife finally did make her appearance, I didn't confront her again and just left her alone. We cleaned up the dishes and went to sleep at night without touching each other or even speaking. The next day we tried to act normal for Jenny's sake, and the atmosphere around the house was a bit better. She did make a sort of apology, saying she was sorry I didn't attend the event, and no matter how bad those pictures looked, nothing inappropriate went on between Jim and her. I noted that she didn't say she was sorry. She went, just that she was sorry. How it worked out. I let her speak and didn't offer an answer. A few days later, I overheard her on the phone again. She thought I was in the backyard and didn't notice. I was around the corner when she was speaking openly. It's okay. Yeah, I can talk. He's out in the yard now. He's still real upset about everything. I don't want to approach him about that yet. Yeah, well, I do. Maybe if we are careful, we can. I don't know. I just don't want to stir up any more trouble. She listened for a bit, then said, he won't be so forgiving next time. Okay, yeah, I'll call you later. Of course I miss you. We can't. Now, please. I know, just let me talk to him first, okay? Right. I'll work on him tonight and get back to you. Probably tomorrow. Yeah. I can't talk right now. He was out in the yard, but I'm not sure where he is now. Okay, that's okay. Right. Call me. Okay, bye. Then she hung up. I knew something was up, but I wasn't sure what. I suppose she was speaking to Jim, but I couldn't be sure. Coincidentally, Jim called me that very evening. It was just after dinner when I was outside on the patio. It was Friday, and Jenny was sleeping over at a friend's house. She would return Saturday afternoon. I saw the caller ID on my phone and debated whether to take the call. Carol suddenly trotted outside. Is that your phone, honey? She asked me as it was ringing. Now I knew it was a setup. Why don't you answer it? Mark, I grumbled and picked it up. What do you want? A hole, I grumbled, knowing it was Jim. Hi, buddy. I just wanted to talk, he said cheerfully. Carol was watching me as I replied. Oh, yeah? Well, I want a faithful, loving, honest wife. So what? Listen, Mark, I know things have been a little tense between us, so I wanted to do something to break the ice. I didn't reply. I'm having a little get-together at my house. I want to invite you and Carol to join us. It's just a few of our friends that are invited. All nice folks from the area that you know. I'm going to cook out so you don't have to bring anything. Just show up and have a good time. I was silent as I considered his offer. The truth is, I was feeling a little regretful the past few days. Despite my anger, I still loved Carol. I knew she missed having a social life like we used to, and I wished I could entertain, or better. Jim used to be a good friend, my best friend, actually. Despite my feelings, I missed having some guy to hang out with. I noticed that Carol was nearby, staring out at the yard, but clearly pretending she wasn't listening. These two were so transparent it was almost funny. I don't know. Please, Mark, I know how you feel, but we can't go on like this forever. Let's bury the hatchet for a while and have a few beers with friends. Bring Carol, and I'm sure we can all put this beside us. Okay. I glanced at Carol. She looked over and smiled. We'll see. I'll speak to Carol and we'll see. I said, I hope you come, both of you. It's just casual. I have all the food and beer taken care of, so don't worry about bringing anything. I know you'll have a blast, buddy. Hope to see you later. I sat down the phone and Carol immediately asked, Who was that, honey? Nobody, I said indifferently. Carol looked perplexed. Nobody. Tell me, she asked sweetly as if she didn't know. Having a party, I said indifferently. Oh, really? She exclaimed, smiling. That's nice. Yeah, he wants us to go. He wants to bury the hatchet, I said. Carol seemed eager to speak, but she just smiled and asked, So what did you tell him? Are we going? I guess so, I said. She jumped over to me and hugged me close. After so long apart, I felt myself becoming aroused by the warmth of her body. Oh, goody. That's great, Mark, she gushed. I know we'll have a great time. Don't count on it. I snorted. She kissed my cheek and bolted for the house to get ready. I was leery about this whole setup, but I was worn down from all the acrimony and was willing to see how this turned out. Either way, Carol couldn't blame me for not trying to improve our situation. As for Jim and I becoming friends again, that was doubtful. The party was actually quite nice. There were about 30 people there, which was more than I expected. Jim went all out with the food and drinks. Most of the people were married couples with a few unattached females and a couple of single guys. There were enough people there that it wasn't obvious that I was keeping my distance from Jim. Carol stayed by me much of the time. She did go off with her friends for a while, and I hung out with the guys. I drank some beer, but not too much. I wasn't going to get drunk and suddenly act like everything was back to normal. I think Carol noticed my distant demeanor. I thought, Is everything okay? She whispered. I didn't look at her as I mumbled. Yeah, nice party, isn't it, though? I'm having fun. I hope you're too, she said, gazing into my eyes. Hopefully. Then she asked quietly, Have you spoken to Jim? My expression darkened and she noticed. Sorry, I don't want to upset you, Mark, then just leave it alone. You two were such good friends, and I hope you will be again. Forget it, Carol, I told her with a cool glance. Jim and I will never be friends again. Not like before. He's an asshole and always will be. Let's just have fun tonight and not bring up any old bad memories. Carol didn't drink much, and neither did I. Jim was busy playing host and only came over a couple of times to ask how everything was. He had a woman with him, some hot chick he knew from work, and they were sharing host duties. Carol drifted over to Jim and his date. They spoke for a while. When Carol returned, she brought Jim's date over and introduced me. I just nodded and let my wife do all the talking. I don't even remember her name. She probably thought I'm an idiot for not acting more polite, but screw her and Scrooge in too. After a few more minutes of awkward conversation, they went over to the bar and mixed some drinks. Later, Jim put on some music and people began to dance. Carol asked me if I wanted to dance. I said no. She was a bit put off, but didn't complain about it. The sun began to set and the couples with children began to leave. The rest of the crowd began to drink more. A few other couples showed up and joined in. Soon, the beer was flowing freely and the party was starting to get rowdy. Several of the wives we knew were no longer dancing with their spouses. A couple of guys asked Carol to dance. She really accepted, after getting my tacit permission. I stayed in my seat and just watched her in silence. Carol is an attractive woman, so it was no shock when guys kept asking her to dance. She danced some of the fast songs displaying or moves which were very sexy. When the slow songs came on, she was regularly glancing at me. Normally, she could be quite flirty at events like this tonight. She kept her flirtatious behavior to a minimum. She did seem to enjoy herself, but didn't dance too closely with any of her partners. Nothing like the pictures. I saw her in Jim at the charity event, and she didn't dance with Jim when she noticed I wasn't joining in the wife-swapping atmosphere. She quit dancing and sat by me. Carol had briefly left my side and was talking with her friends when Jim's date came over and asked me to dance. I politely refused. She flashed a pout and asked if I wanted another beer. I told her no thanks. She was a pretty young thing, cute with a nice body. Typical of the girls Jim always had around him, but I had no interest in her and tried to give nonverbal hints that I didn't want her company. Instead of getting the hint, she plopped down next to me, gulped her beer, flashed a huge grin, and started a conversation. She wouldn't leave, so to be polite, I chatted with her. She seemed a little drunk and kept giggling at things I said that weren't funny. Between giggles, she kept touching me, rubbing my arm and my leg while laughing. She kept offering to get me another beer. I kept refusing. She kept trying to get me up to dance. At one point, she stood up and began pulling on my arm, making a big scene in front of the people around us. Everyone was laughing at my reluctance. I was embarrassed and asked her to stop. She stopped and began talking for a while before she did it again, but this time she slipped and accidentally fell into my lap. I tried to get her to her feet, but she resisted. She just stayed there laughing, rubbing her tight little bum on my groin with her arms around my neck. I removed her arms from my neck and lifted her up as I was moving her. I happened to glance across the deck. There was Jim and Carol next to each other, speaking softly together, but really watching me fend off this drunk girl. Suddenly, I knew what was up. This whole party was a setup. They were trying to manipulate me into behaving as they had at the charity event. This sexy girl was basically throwing herself at me, trying to get me to behave badly so I wouldn't be able to criticize them. I shot my wife a harsh stare. She caught my look, cringed, and realized I was onto their trick. I kept my eyes on my conniving wife as I kept pushing the girl away. When she wouldn't stop pestering me, I unceremoniously shoved her off my lap. The people around us were laughing as I marched across the deck away from this cheap bimbo. I passed by Jim and growled, "Nice try, a-hole." His expression darkened as I marched away. A few moments later, Carol came trotting over, probably to deny there was any ulterior motive. I didn't want to hear any more lies when she started to say something. I cut her off with a glare. The party was in full swing as I informed my wife it was time to leave. She looked disappointed but didn't argue. I didn't bother to thank Jim for the invitation and went straight to my car. Carol said it was impolite not to thank him, so she made her way to Jim and his date. She spoke to them for a bit as Jim glanced over at me with a strange look. I was glad that he didn't come over to me, because I'm not sure how I would have handled it. Carol then said goodbye to her friends. She obviously wanted to hang around because the party was still going strong, but she respected my wishes and we left the party as quickly as I could. The drive home was somber. Carol casually mentioned how much fun she had and how nice everything was. I just nodded and kept silent. Carol chattered on about some of her friends. Now, nicely, Jim had set everything up, but my silence conveyed the strain, atmosphere. By the time we got home, I realized the whole thing was a setup. Jim's invitation Jenny sleepover scheduled the same night, and his girlfriend trying to make a fool out of me. I was being manipulated, but I held my tongue, and Carol was relieved that I didn't make a scene. Since the evening was all planned out, I wasn't surprised when my clever wife began making amorous advances. From the moment we got home, she was acting sweet, touching and kissing me all the way to the bedroom. It had been quite a while since we had sex, probably more than a month. Despite my irritation with my conniving wife, Carol's a sexy woman. Tonight she was dressed to tease and please, and by this time I was worn as a goat. I refused and turned the other way. I just lay there in the dark, thinking about the party we went to. I replayed the evening when she was dancing and having fun. I remembered her speaking to Jim and how he kept glancing over at me while they talked. It was all contrived. They were manipulating me. I replayed every second of their conversation and kept thinking about Carol's giddy reaction as they talked. I also remember the night when she decided to go with Jim and how comfortable she was hugging and kissing him and how anxious she was to get him onto the sofa. I know she was drunk and horny, but something about their friendly relationship didn't seem right. Jim's reaction also bothered me. He seemed to enjoy making out with my wife, but worried about the location. I'm not sure that he wouldn't have taken her up on her offer if Jenny and I weren't there. I know he's been a friend for decades, but the way he made out with my wife, the now friendly they were, seemed wrong. Have they done this before? Maybe this wasn't the first time they dated. I tried to put these paranoid feelings aside because I wanted to trust Carol, and I used to trust Jim, too. Inside my head, a little voice was whispering caution. Over dinner, Carol was quite animated about the party we went to. There was no mention of the charity event. Jim called me a few times after his party, but I didn't answer and just let it go to voicemail. His message was that he was glad we came to his house and that he'd like to get together again real soon. He wanted us to get back to being friends, and he'd go more than halfway to get there. I told Carol that Jim had been calling me, but I wished he wouldn't. She seemed pleased to hear that we had contact. She asked if she could invite him over for dinner, when I told her no. Carol frowned, and we had another argument. She eventually told me to just get over my hissy fit, and she so delicately put it and kept reminding me what a good friend Jim was and how he'd been there to help us. I knew he was successful at his sales job and made more than me. I was sick of hearing her praise him so often, but kept my mouth shut. I guess Carol thought that everything was back to normal between us. Probably Jenny did too. She was now talking about Jim as if he was still my friend. I wasn't actually there yet, but in the interest of keeping the family atmosphere pleasant, I held my tongue. That turned out to be a big mistake. I tried to keep tabs on Carol, but since she worked part-time and I was very busy at my job, it wasn't possible. She was home each night when I got home, and she always had dinner ready for Jenny and me. We tried to have sex, but she seemed distracted at times, like she was just going through the motions. Of course I got off, but if I expected all the little kisses and touches our lovemaking had been before, that didn't happen anymore. I was disappointed in her degraded relationship, but with my job taking so much of my energy, I didn't have the patience to address it. Carol didn't seem like it bothered her at all. She kept up the house, kept Jenny taken care of. But we were barely making love. Now. I guess I should have been happy for that. I managed to get off early one night and wanted to take Carol out to dinner. An early evening lately meant getting home before 6 o'clock. It would be a late dinner for us, but I thought I could get Jenny to stay over at her friend's house that night, and we could go out later. Of course, our finances were stretched, but I thought we needed some time to reconnect. I called home, but Carol wasn't there, so I called her at work that afternoon, and a woman answered and told me that Carol wasn't available. "Oh, all right. Will she be available later?" I asked. "Not today." She took the afternoon off. She replied, "She should be back on Monday, though. Can I take a message now?" "I'll try her then," I said, perplexed. She wasn't at work. She hadn't called me and never mentioned that she had plans to take the day off. I called her cell phone and it rolled over to voicemail, so I left a message. "Hi, Carol. Just wanted to ask you out for dinner tonight. I'm just taking you out and would love to take you to a nice place and show you off. Please call me back and I'll make all the arrangements. Normally I get home by 7 or later. I guess she expected me then, but I was pissed when she didn't call me back until nearly 6 o'clock. Hi, Mark, she said cheerfully. Sorry I missed your call. Honey, I wanted to take you out. I sighed. I guess now it's too late. Oh, I'm so sorry, baby, she replied. I had to meet with a client, you know. It ran a little late, so I couldn't get back to you. Okay, then. See you at home, right? Love you. Love you, too. The conversation was weird. Meet with a client. When did Carol start meeting with clients? Her coworker never mentioned that. Why take the day off? And why was her phone off? I hardly ever called during the day, so she had no reason to expect me to. But the whole thing stunk, and I wasn't sure why. I picked up some pizza and just went home. When I got there, both Carol and Jenny were waiting. Jenny was happy about the pizza, and Carol apologized about missing my call. I didn't question her about it, but it was strange and had me thinking bad thoughts. That night, Carol informed me that there was a big party at the Royal Hotel this weekend, and she wanted to go. It's going to be wonderful, Mark, she gushed before she saw my dark look and quipped, Now don't look at me like that. I know what you're thinking. Don't worry, honey, it's not going to cost you anything. There's no cover charge for this, and my company is picking up the tab for the dinner and drinks. It's some kind of a public relations gig to attract customers. There's also going to be a band dancing and everything. We're going to have a blast this weekend. Are you sure we're free this weekend? Carol shot me a goofy grin and snickered. Oh, stop it, you wet blanket. You know we are. We don't go anywhere anymore. And don't worry, you won't have to pay a dime. I listened to her excitement about this party. I wish there was some way out of it, but she had her mind made up. I just hoped everything would go all right. Despite my reluctance, I was actually looking forward to taking her to this party. My wife is very attractive and fun. I wanted to take her to a nice private dinner and maybe some dancing, but we needed a night out together and maybe this public party. Was it? Little did I know. The night before the party, she hit me with the rest of the story. She was mentioning details of the party when she said, in a suspicious manner, And you know, Jim's going to be there too. Honey. Jim, what the hell? I didn't know that. We were finishing dinner and Jenny was already in her room. Carol was just staring at her plate, moving the food around with her fork. Honey, Jim said he would be there, I blurted out with surprise. She looked startled for a second, but regained her composure quickly. I heard from someone at work, she said without looking up. Why is Jim going to be there? I think he's dating one of the clients. You mean that woman he had at his party? No, not her, somebody else. I think Jim's going to be there, I repeated angrily. Tell me the truth, Carol. Have you spoken to him about this dance party? She glanced up at me with a guilty look and mumbled, No, not really. I just heard something. Maybe I forgot. He called you, didn't he? I accused, feeling a knot in my stomach. I guess maybe, she said, her casual attitude suddenly transformed into irritation. Yes, he called me. He did. So what? You know I don't like that prick. And now I find out you're speaking to him behind my back. It's not like that, she answered defensively. He's a friend. He just called up to say he'd be there and hoped we would. Too. I stood up with an angry expression. I shoved the rest of my food into the trash and rinsed off my plate. That's just great, I sneered. After all we've been through. You're talking to that asshole behind my back. He's our friend, Mark. My friend, too, she said defensively. He's no friend of mine. And you're calling him and probably sneaking around with him behind my back. Her eyes looked straight at me as she stated firmly, You can't tell me who to talk to. I'm a grown woman and I can choose my own friends. I just wanted you to know ahead of time that he'll be there. I was just being polite and didn't want to spring it on you and make you think that it was some setup. Can't you see that? Yeah, I see exactly. I already told you that. I want you to stop talking to him. I guess you don't give a damn about my feelings. That's not true. Just don't have any contact with him, you hear? No. Damn it. Mark, I'll talk to him if I want, she replied curtly. He's a friend and I will not shut him out. If you want to ignore Jim, I can't stop you. But I'm not going to turn my back on a friend of ours, so that's it? Yes, she said sympathetically as she placed her hand on mine. I don't want you to be mad. I want my husband back. Please go to this party with me. All my friends will be there. It's important to me, honey. I left it like that. I was going, but I wasn't happy about it. The night of the party, I drove Jenny over to her friend's house. She was going to stay the night so Carol and I could party as late as we liked. Carol spent most of the evening getting ready. She had her hair done and her makeup, too. I just had to put on a suit and shoes, which took me about 10 minutes. Carol must have spent over an hour in the bedroom when she came down. She looked stunning in a skimpy black cocktail dress that displayed her sumptuous curves to the max. "Where did you get that dress?" "I've never seen it before," I immediately thought aloud. Carol shot me a gloating smirk and snickered. "I bought it with my own money, Mark, so don't get all pissy about where it came from. I do make money, even though it's not as much as you. And I also bought the shoes, too." If you're wondering, I tried to swallow my anger, but it was difficult. Her long, shapely legs were exposed in the short hemline of the skirt, and high heels made her calves flex every time she took a step. The dress was low-cut, showing a bit of cleavage. "You ready?" she asked, slipping her arm in mine. "Let's go out on the porch and wait for Jim." My jaw dropped. "Jim?" I gasped with surprise. "What do you mean? Jim's going to pick us up and take us there?" she said, as if I should have already known. "That way you can drink if you want." "But what? Why?" I sputtered. "We can just drive over there." Carol held my gaze and spoke with determination. "I already spoke to him and he's coming over right now." "You spoke to him? My God! But why?" "I wasn't exactly sure if you were going," she said, her blue eyes staring straight at me. "You were such a snit at the last event. I wasn't sure if you'd stay me up again. You took Jenny away and I was worried you might just bail on me. There's no way I was going to miss this event tonight. So in case you got cold feet, I called Jim and he said he'd take me." "Take you? Was he prepared to take you without me?" "No, I didn't want to miss it, Mark," she explained in a reasonable tone. "I thought you might try to blow me off and just not go. Jim's a gentleman, and he said he would take me if you didn't show up. So he's on his way over right now. If you want to go, be ready in 10 minutes, Mark, or we're leaving without you." "Damn it!" I shot back, growing more angry by the second. "So you were going to wait for me. Well, why don't you and Jim just go without me? Maybe I didn't want to go anyway." Carol's expression grew angry, like I'd never seen her cheeks turn bright red, and smoke seemed to be coming out of her ears. She snorted angrily, stood up, and stomped her way into the kitchen. "Do what you want, you asshole!" she shot over her shoulder. I could hear Carol pouring herself a glass of wine in the kitchen. I took a deep breath and shrugged, trying to make some sense of this latest change of plans. I went to the bathroom to wash my face and calm down while I was there. The doorbell rang and I knew Jim had arrived. Carol must have let him in and I could hear them talking, probably about me. I couldn't hear what Jim said, but I was angry that he was so involved with us again. When it came down, I saw them chatting. My blood boiled, and I could not hold it in any longer. I told Carol, "Since you two already plan to go together, leave me." "Come on, honey. Don't behave like that," Carol mumbled. "I don't want to go if he's going with us. I wanted to go with my wife, not his friend." I saw Carol stand up and leave. I guess the marriage was over now. She returned later that night and just got in bed. The next morning, Carol was still giving me the cold shoulder, but we did speak about normal things at times. The girls schedule household chores and such, but there was a lack of warmth that was obvious. Work was giving me a hard time as well. My boss had me working late most nights, so I guess I wasn't around as much as I would have liked. One evening, I got off early and came home to find Jim in the kitchen having coffee with Carol. I nearly exploded, but they barely reacted when I came in. When I asked him why he was there, he seemed a bit unsure before Carol mentioned they needed some boxes brought down from the attic, and since I wasn't around, she asked him to help. Jim just nodded and told me it was on his way home from work, so it was no problem. I accepted her explanation and went upstairs to shower. When it came down, he was gone. I had another hard week at work. It sucked so much, I was desperate to keep things calm. When I finally got home, somehow Carol seemed to have accepted Jim back into our house. Any complaint I had about that was met with a huge argument a couple of times. When I got home late, I found out Jim had already eaten dinner with my family while I ate the leftovers. Jenny was very excited and told me Jim had given her a new pair of sneakers. Another time, she said he bought her a jacket. Each time she relayed this info to me. She seemed delighted to have him around. Carol did as well. One evening I got home and found that Carol had fixed some great food. Jim was there again. They were all chatting loudly as I walked in. Carol glanced at me without speaking, almost daring me to make a fuss when I didn't. They went back to their conversation, ignoring me as I sat down to join them. It was around this time that I began to feel like a third wheel, basically an outsider in my own home. Carol and I were speaking, but barely. Sex was not happening. I couldn't help feeling that Carol really didn't care if I was there or not. If Jim was there when he got home, he acted friendly and asked me about my work. He acted like you wanted to know how things were going, so I replied, not wanting to make a fuss about his presence. But soon I began to resent how often he was around and how eager my whole family seemed to be in accepting him. There. One evening, after a particularly long visit, I took Jim out onto the back patio to have a word with him. I expressed that I was uncomfortable with how much he was around. I told him that if he came over from now on, I'd like a phone call beforehand because it was only polite to call me first. He listened in silence, gazing at me with a strange disinterest in expression. He said no problem, that he didn't want to cause any problems and he'd respect my wishes from now on. I thought that was the end of it. Boy, was I wrong. That evening, when Carol and I got into bed, I remembered how she had reacted during dinner, seeming to be in a great mood, chatting and laughing at things, Jim said. I also thought about my conversation with Jim. I'd been working late a lot, and Carol and I were not together much anymore. Something inside told me that I needed to reconnect with my lovely wife on a physical level, since she was in such a good mood. I thought tonight was the night to begin to put our relationship back on track. After a great dinner, I helped my wife clean up. She seemed to be in an unusually good mood. We were speaking normally for a change. Jenny went to bed and I followed my wife to the bedroom. I began throwing some subtle hints to my wife for sex. I knew she could tell that I was horny, but she didn't respond. She didn't shut me down, but wasn't receptive to any of my advances. When she finished cleaning up in the bathroom, she emerged wearing her long flannel nightgown, which was a silent message that she wasn't interested in anything physical. Once she was under the covers, I moved closer and snuggled against her flannel-clad body. My hand landed on her stomach and I felt her stiffen. She immediately pushed my hand away and turned over on her side with her back facing me. Normally I would give up, but I was still upset about having Jim over and it had been quite a while since we had sex. Just the scent of her hair and the warmth of her body had me hard and aching for release. Jenny was asleep and it wasn't that late, so I decided to ignore her unspoken rejection and went forward, hoping she'd change her mind. I slid over behind her, held her hips, and began to spoon against her body. "Honey, you look so sexy tonight. I really am turned on," I told her softly as I began to push near her body. "Not tonight, Mark." When I didn't stop, she repeated. I said, "Not tonight. I'm tired. Maybe some other time." Okay. I was stunned by her rejection. It had been weeks since I enjoyed her charms. More than a month. I decided that I wasn't taking no for an answer. "Come on, baby, it's been a while. You know how much you turned me on?" She pushed my hand off of her and repeated firmly, "Not tonight." I kept trying to hold her until she spun around and told me in a rather harsh tone of voice, "Will you stop?" I said I was tired and I meant it. "What the hell, Carol?" I snapped back. "You've been shutting me out for weeks now. What am I, a monk? I'm just tired. Please don't make a big deal about this," she said, sitting up and throwing the covers back. I gazed down at her angrily. "What the hell's going on? Carol?" I flipped on the light next to our bed and said, "We haven't made love in over a month. You've been distant and mean for weeks. Is there something wrong with you? With me? You may have forgotten, but I'm still your husband, and you have to talk to me." I guess my angry tone and harsh expression finally got through. She turned over and gazed up at me, her blue eyes flashing with anger. "You asshole!" she snapped. "I told you I'm tired, but you don't seem to care a bit about how I feel. I take care of the kids in the house and I stay home waiting for you. But you never take me out. You never bring me flowers anymore, or even come home on time. Now you want to just screw me? Satisfy your filthy pleasure and go to sleep. Filthy pleasure." I was caught off guard by her bitterness. I drew back from her angry outburst as she sat up and shook her finger in my face. "You selfish creep! I've given up so much and all you want. Then, Mark, you want some sex? Is that it? Is that what it'll take for you to leave me alone? In one quick motion, Carol pulled her nightgown up to her waist, lay back down with her eyes closed, and spread her legs. Well, she said, glaring at me, don't just sit there with a stupid look on her face. Just put it in. Put your little wiener in me and screw me. That's all you wanted, right? A piece of meat. So get to it and hurry up so I can get some sleep. I was stunned, filled with mixed emotions. She opened her eyes and glared at me like I was some lecherous old man. There was no love at all. I decided to just lay back down and forget it. But Carol didn't seem to want to stop. She was on a roll and wasn't going to let it go. She looked down and saw that my arousal had already gone soft. Come on, Mark. She coaxed with a weird grin. What's the matter, honey? Lose your cool now that your wife is ready to put out. Are you done? I bet Jim wouldn't refuse me. He would lose his erection if I gave it up to him. You're such a loser. Damn it, you can't get it up if the woman is not totally compliant. Well, honey, are you ready? She smiled wickedly and chuckled. I thought so. She closed her legs and pulled the covers over herself. I heard her whisper loud enough for me to hear. Loser. Her last remark totally pissed me off. She'd been cruel to me before, but never like this. Something inside me broke you, which I cried. I guess you're just Jim's meat now. I bolted off the bed, headed for the door behind me. She screamed, You asshole! At least he's not a loser like you. I stomped out of the room before I did something rash. I nearly ripped the bedroom door off the hinges when I slammed it. I knew the whole house shook and felt bad that Ginny had probably woken up from the yelling. My temper was nearly overwhelming. My good sense. I've never been so angry at her before. This was even worse than the night after the charity event. The next morning, I got up, still upset. Carol didn't speak about what happened last night, and neither did I. She fixed Jenny's breakfast as I left the house without saying a word. I barely slept and was spitting mad as I left the house. I knew that something was seriously wrong with my marriage. A couple of days later, I got home from work and saw Jim's car in the driveway. I was not happy about that. I was home from work on time for a change and hoped Carol and I could speak tonight. Have dinner and a family night without him around. So I was quite upset to see he was here again since the night of our blow-up. We hadn't spoken. I knew she was unhappy about the argument, and so was I. I hoped we would eventually talk about it and get over it, but we hadn't. I thought that maybe tonight was the night. When I saw his car and knew he hadn't called, I was disturbed. I just have to remind him of his promise, later. But at the same time, I knew how much Carol liked having him around, and was hoping his presence would somehow thawed or cold. Marital relationship. I entered the house and was surprised to find them together on the sofa. Hi, honey, I called out. I looked at him and said abruptly, Jim. Hello, Mark, he replied in a subdued tone. What's for dinner? I asked my wife as I hung up my jacket. Carol gazed at me with a blank stare looking for me. She replied, There's roast beef and veggies in the fridge you can heat up in the microwave. She spoke calmly with no emotion, and she pointed to the recliner. But first, can you sit down here? Mark, we need to speak to you. We? That's strange. I remained standing, surprised at her strange monotone and the distant look on her face. I began to wonder what she wanted to tell me that was so important. Maybe someone died. She was fired, or maybe she was pregnant. What's up, honey? Where's Jenny? I asked. She's having a sleepover at Becky's on a school night. She replied, ignoring my question. Carol asked, Would you like a drink, Mark? Maybe a glass of wine or a beer? Mel, I'm fine. Her face showed little emotion. I also noticed how close she and Jim were on the sofa. Usually they'd be at the kitchen table when I got home, so the closed seating arrangement was unusual. Carol took a sip of her wine and then turned to me. There's something we need to discuss. Mark, why don't you have a seat? She gestured to the recliner again and glanced over Jim. He glanced back, giving her a subtle nod. What's going on here? I blurted out, feeling quite uncomfortable. Please sit down, she said more forcefully, pointing to the chair with serious trepidation. I sat down in the chair across from them. Mark, there's no easy way to say this. She took a breath, and then the words flowed out. You know I love you and Jenny, but things have not been good between us for a while now. I know you're working hard for the family and you're a good father, but there's something wrong with our marriage. What? I whispered, my throat constricting. Our marriage? I glanced at my best friend for clarity and found him staring at the floor. Carol took another sip, glanced back at him, and then continued. I'm not happy. Mark and I haven't been for a while, she admitted in a soft but firm tone. I know you weren't either. You're aware that we haven't been close for months. Our sex life sucks, and whatever fondness we have between us seems to have gone cold. I was stunned that she would bring up our lack of sex in front of Jim. It was a very private matter, and I wanted to keep it that way. Carol, I sputtered, this isn't the kind of thing to bring up in public. You know, I don't think Jim wants to hear about that, I said to Carol. She gazed at me, her eyes narrowing. I could almost see a glimmer of pity as she considered my response. I'm afraid that he does. Mark? She replied indifferently. You see, Jim knows exactly how I feel. I've been seeing him for the past few months, and we've grown close, closer than I ever expected, and closer than you and I have ever been. I felt like the floor had just collapsed. I gulped. What the hell? I noticed they were holding hands. Jim gave her hand a little squeeze of support as she continued cutting my heart out. Mark, I love you, honey, but I'm not in love with you anymore. I've been unhappy for a while, and Jim has tried to help. He's been a great friend to me, and he and I are together now. We've fallen in love. What now? Damn you! I rose to my feet and glared at my former best friend and faithless wife. I was certainly angry, hurt, amazed, and confused. This was unbelievable. You must be kidding. This is some sick joke, right? If looks could kill, Jim would have been struck dead. Carol just took another sip of wine, shrugged indifferently inside. Her gaze of pity infuriated me. It's true. Mark, I'm sorry. How long? Carol? I snapped, hoping she'd respond angrily to my insult. I was wrong. She had been practicing her speech, and she was in complete control. Her beautiful face lacked any emotion. I know that this is hard for you, Mark, and I never wanted it to happen. She spoke calmly, adding, but it did. As you and I have grown apart, Jim has been there for me to help and support me. You cheating wife? I shouted, not taking the bait. Carol said yes. Well, in any case, Mark, he's been a real friend to console me. I admit that we've been seeing each other. I mean, we're not able to hide it any longer. We didn't want you to find out from someone else, so we had to tell you the truth about us. I lost it. My brain was swirling with emotions. She's cheating on me. My beautiful wife and my asshole best friend, now ex-best friend. You cheating, lying wife, I cried in despair. My face grew hot and my expression harsh in a bitter tone. I asked, tell me, my faithful, lying, cheating wife, has he screwed yet? Carol stiffened and looked a little shaky before flashing a cool stare. Yes, Mark, Jim and I are lovers. I glared at Jim and snapped. You backstabbing piece of shit. You took advantage of our marital problems. I thought you were my friend. I trusted you, and you do this. You screw my wife, and now you're taking her from me. You asshole! I started to move toward them, and Jim suddenly stood up. His tall, thick frame towered over me. He held out his hands in a defensive gesture. Please, Mark, just settle down, he told me. We didn't plan this, buddy. It just happened. Don't call me buddy, you creep. You're no friend of mine, I shouted. Come on, Mark. You know I care about you. I feel terrible about how this worked out, but I love Carol. I can't help it. I want her to be happy, and she's certainly not happy the way things are. You don't know shit, I yelled, nearly out of control. Please, Mark, Carol said, rising from her seat. I know this will be hard for you, darling, but we can't stay married. It's something I have to do. I'll make this as easy for you as I can. Jim will support me and Jenny. My Jenny, I screamed. She could have hit me with a 2x4 and had less effect than the words she just spoke. I'm her mother, Carol pleaded. She needs me in, Jim said. You cheating wife, you said, bitch. You're not taking my daughter. You go screw Jim. You both can go to hell. But I'll never give Jenny up. Never. She's your daughter, Carol, Carol said, her voice rising for the first time. You don't have to give her up. She's yours, and always will be. Please, Mark, Jim said, pleading. Let's be reasonable, okay? What happens between Carol and me won't affect you being her father. It's just that Jenny needs her mother to take care of her. You'll have all the visitation you want. Don't think we'll keep you from her. But I love Carol, and she loves me. Jim assured me Jenny will always be your daughter. But when she's with us, she'll be very well taken care of. I assure you of that, my friend. Friend? I spat out some friend you are, you asshole. Never call me your friend again, you backstabbing scum. Sucker. You're a snake in the grass stealing my wife, and now my daughter. Now I see why Carol and I can't get together anymore. You've been undercutting her marriage the whole time, playing like a friend while trying to steal Carol and Jenny from me. You're the sickest asshole. I must have called him a few more names, but I don't remember. Losing my wife and threatening to take my precious baby suddenly made me insane. I turned my anger toward my former best friend and made my first big mistake. You creep! I'll kill you! I cried, launching myself at the big guy and flinging a fist in his face. Jim's taller than me and a lot heavier. He had always been big and athletic ever since I knew him. He easily deflected my punch and shoved me into an end table, causing me to stumble onto the floor, embarrassed and in emotional pain. I hit the ground and sprung to my feet. Carol let out a scream. "No! Stop it!" she cried as I launched another swing at Jim. This time he caught my fist in mid-air with as little effort as if you were holding back a child. Fighting has never been my strong point, so I guess it was stupid to attack him like this. "Damn it, Mark!" Jim shouted, shoving me back into a nearby chair. "Just listen for a minute and get control of yourself." Carol was standing next to him, staring down at me with a look of disbelief, pity, and amazement. Jim deflected my attack with so little effort. I felt humiliated. "Please, Mark," she pleaded. "It doesn't have to be this way. Jim and I are asking nothing from you. He makes enough to support me and Jenny without a problem. Jenny will always be your daughter, and of course I'll give you generous visitation rights." "Never!" I shouted. "Come on, Mark," Jim said with pity. "You may not think so right now, but we can still be friends. You know I care about you, but I love Carol. I know this will take some time, and I'm going to help as much as I can." He took a breath and said, "We can't help that we fell in love, man. Just accept that and everything will be a lot smoother. I know you don't believe me right now, but we both still care about you a lot. I'll help you get over this. And Jenny will always know that you're a father." I was still smarting from my humiliating beatdown. Carol was watching, sobbing a little, but her expression was more pity than sympathy. Big Jim just stood there waiting for my next reaction. "I knew you worked out regularly." Of course, he had a lot of time to do that, being single and not having to provide for a family. My job and family responsibilities left me with almost no free time. I was out of shape, being too busy working long hours to support my family. I could never take him in a fair fight, but my anger overcame my good sense and I wasn't giving up yet. I acted like I was coming down and stood back up as I stringed my clothes and took a deep breath. They both were watching me warily. Carol had on high heels, so she was nearly at my height. Jim was much taller and looked down at me as I shot him, a look of pure hate. "Well, this sure has come as a surprise," I said bitterly. "The two people I trust most in the whole world have just stabbed me in the back." "I'm sorry," Carol whimpered. "I just couldn't let you go in thinking you were fine. We couldn't do that to you." "Yeah, right," I whispered dejectedly. "Well, screw you both. Please, Mark," Jim said. "I feel terrible about this. You know, but we respect you too much to just go behind your back. We still care about you a lot." "Yeah, I can tell," I said sarcastically. "Please understand," Carol said with sad eyes. "I didn't mean for it to work out like this. It just happened. I'm so sorry, honey." She went to hug me, but I surprised them both and pushed her back against them hard. She stumbled and fell back against Jim's chest, and he caught her before she fell down. In a split second, he caught her. He was vulnerable. I quickly swung my fist as hard as I could with all my strength and slammed it into Jim's head. At the last second, he saw it coming and his eyes widened. His face remained as my knuckles came crashing into his nose. There was a sickening sound of bone snapping and blood splattered onto our carpet. Carol screamed out in panic now as she watched the guy collapse at her feet, blood spurting from his nose like a fountain. He was woozy but still coherent. I was on him in a second, swinging my fists into his bleeding face. But he recovered quickly. He took a few blows to the head and then pushed me away. "You idiot!" he shouted in a weird nasal tone. He started to come at me, but Carol pulled his arm. "No, Jim, don't!" she cried, holding him back. I wanted him to come at me, but he just stood there wincing with his nose dripping blood. "Come on, wife stealer," I goaded, trying to get him to fight. "You can steal her behind my back, but you're just a gutless creep in a fair fight. I need a woman to protect you. Can't fight your own battles. Hiding behind a woman's skirt. What's wrong with you? You loser!" His eyes were raging, but Carol clung to his arm. I guess he knew he was the eventual winner anyway. "Getting my wife in the end. Scream, Mark," he finally said. "You're lucky she's here to protect you. Don't pull this again or I'm going to kick your ass." "Big talk," I growled with my hands in a fighting stance. Jim relaxed and let Carol pull him away. He took out a handkerchief and mopped up the blood flowing from his nose. The two of them proceeded to the front door in silence before Carol turned back to me angrily. "It didn't have to be this way," Carol snapped. "We tried to let you down easily, Mark, but you had to get physical. Screw you and screw in too," I told her bitterly. "Oh, I guess you've already done that, bitch." Carol's face twisted in anger, but she didn't speak. I then noticed the two suitcases sitting by the closet. Jim picked one up and headed for the front door, casting me angry glances as he left. Carol picked up the smaller one and followed him up the door. She stopped once, looking back at me like she wanted to say something, but instead just turned and left as they drove off. I bolted to my car and drove like a maniac to Becky's house. I parked and ran to the front door, knocking on it in a panic. Becky's mother answered with a sad look on her face. "Hello, Mark," she said in a sad voice. "I know why you're here." Carol called a few minutes earlier and spoke to Jenny. Jenny said her mom told her to leave the house and go somewhere. I don't know what she told her. I think they're picking her up somewhere, but they didn't tell me where. "You know about this?" I asked in disbelief. "Well, not everything. Carol asked me to keep it quiet, so I did. She then looked at me with the same pity my wife did. I'm so sorry about all this. I always thought you two had a great marriage. I didn't know about all your problems." "Yeah, I didn't either," I told her angrily. "Do you know where Jenny went? Any friends? She is around. I really need to get to her. I don't, Mark. I'm sorry. I would tell you if I did." "You know that," she said, and I growled, shaking with anger. "She's a cheating wife, and you're covering for her." I know that now. I wonder if your husband knows you're covering for a woman that's cheating on her husband. Maybe you are too, and you two cover for each other. I don't have time for cheating wives anymore, so don't ever speak to me again." She was angry and clear to me before slamming the door in my face. I left her house in a blaze of despair. Once again, my scheming wife and ex-friend had outsmarted me. They had everything covered. It was all planned out. Carol had betrayed me, and now Jenny was gone too. I couldn't think straight anymore. My mind was swirling with all the issues suddenly thrust upon me. I went home to an empty house, feeling like I was dead. I managed to get to work the next day, somehow. After a few hours, I began to feel a little bit normal again. The intensive counting workload was no longer a dreary job. It was a blessing, something to keep my mind off my problems. After work, I went home and tried to think straight. The first thing I did was call Jenny. "Hello, Dad." She answered right away. "Jenny, my God, I miss you so much, sweetie. I want to come get you and bring you home with me." "Honey," I said desperately. There was a pause that grew awkward. "Where are you? I am with Mom." She answered in a tense tone. "Mom said I should tell you that I'm fine, and where are you? I want to come get you," I insisted. "I can't, Dad." She sobbed. "Mom said I have to wait a bit before I can see you again. She's pretty upset right now, and I'm upset with her." "Not you, baby," I interrupted. "They stabbed me in the back. But you did nothing wrong. Nothing. I just need to see you, and we need to be together, please." Suddenly, the line was cut off. I called her back, but the call just went to voicemail. I pounded the table in frustration. No doubt Carol was filling her head with all sorts of lies. I bolted back to the car and zoomed over to Jim's house. I ran up to the door and pounded on it, but there was no answer. I checked the garage and found his SUV wasn't there. Neither was his BMW. I walked around the house looking in windows but didn't see anyone. Suddenly, a police car drove up. The officer bowed out, glaring at me, and called me over. "I'm looking for my daughter," I told him before he could ask. "Yeah," he said, looking at me with little sympathy. "I know the neighbors called the station and said someone was poking around the house. I also heard about your separation and the problem with your wife." "Who told you that?" I said wearily. "Does it matter?" He said, "You have to go now. You're not wanted around this house. If you return, you're trespassing. I'll have to cuff you and take you down to the station for questioning." I was nearly out of control. I took a deep breath and got in my car. Jim must have taken them off somewhere out of my reach. They outsmarted me again. Of course, I got a lawyer and he gave me all the bad news. I'd have to split all our assets, including the house. Carol would no doubt get custody of Jenny, despite her running around on me. I might have a chance for custody if the judge found that I was a good parent and that Jenny would agree to live with me now. That was my saving grace. Despite the brief phone call with her, I knew she loved me. I'd been there when she was sick. I took her to her after-school events. I went to her school to see her teacher on Parents' Night. I had been there for every major event in her life. But now I was alone. Carol had Jim to keep her company. I needed someone to help me get over this terrible situation. I needed Jenny in my life and knew that she'd be with me so he could be some sort of family again. I was served with the divorce papers at home. Carol knew my work schedule and must have informed her lawyer. She attached a note to the decree that said she didn't want to embarrass me by serving me at work. Tough. I could have cared less about that. It said our finances would be split 50-50. We could sell the house and split the proceeds, or she could buy me out and live at home with Jenny. According to her lawyer, that was her preference, to live in our house so Jenny could continue her education in the same school district. We'd each keep our cars. There was no alimony, but I'd have to pay for custody of Jenny. My lawyer said it was an equitable split. I didn't agree. After all, she ran out on me and was fooling around for months. Jenny was my daughter, and I wanted full custody. He said I was foolish, but he'd submit a counteroffer. From what I told him. In the meantime, that jerk Jim took my family away on a vacation to Florida. I never found out exactly where Jenny did call me. Our conversations were strained, and she acted very nervous. I tried to tell her I loved her and that I needed her, but I came off sounding desperate. Now I was desperate to get back some shred of self-respect. With my family gone, I threw myself into my work. There was always something to do for a licensed accountant, and I was working overtime as much as I could. I never heard when Carol and Jenny returned from Florida. I guess they didn't want me to know, the day of our court date. I arrived with my lawyer and Carol and Jim arrived with theirs. I cast him a glaring, hateful look, trying to kill him with my eyes. He just looked away and didn't return my gaze. Carol just looked indifferent, as if the breakup of our family and her failed marriage were already in the past. When it came time for the final disposition, the judge took Jenny into his private chambers and spoke to her for nearly an hour. I kept asking my lawyer why it was taking so long. I knew she must miss me by now. I hadn't seen her in weeks. She just had to tell the judge that she wanted to stay with me in her home, and I could finally get on with my life. The judge finally came out and issued his final ruling. He said it was a difficult decision and that neither Carol nor I should dismiss how hard it was for a 14-year-old to make such a choice. It ended up that Jenny was going to live with Carol in a daze. I nearly fell over. I barely heard a word after that. I walked out of the courtroom before he finished with the judge yelling at me to sit back down. I ignored that jerk and just staggered to the hallway. When I finally got my brain back, my lawyer came out and told me the rest of the judge's decision. I would have to pay for custody and would have to either buy out Carol's half of the house or sell it and split the equity. He seemed pleased with the decision and actually looked proud that I wouldn't have to pay alimony and that Carol had to give me generous visitation rights. "You came out okay, Mark," he said, slapping me on the back. "It could have been a lot worse." I was speechless. Carol emerged from the courtroom, glanced over at me with a pitying look, and Jim just left without saying anything. He took her by the arm and led my cheating wife out of the courthouse. I never saw Jenny. I was in a daze as I walked out to the parking lot. Carol came over to me. Jim was a few yards away, looking guilty. I noticed he still had a bandage on his nose. "This can work out, Mark," Carol said pleasantly. "I know this isn't what you wanted, but Jenny loves you and wants to be with you. She lives with us, of course, but you can see her anytime you want. Both Jim and I want you to be in Jenny's life, and we'll do everything we can to accommodate and make this transition as smooth as possible for you." I just stared at her in disbelief. Was she insane? When I didn't answer, Carol said in a soothing tone, "Please, Mark, I know this is difficult. We want you to accept this judgment. Let's work to make Jenny's life as smooth as we can. It's for her benefit, you know." Finally, my mind returned. I looked over at Jim, who was gazing blankly at me, then looked straight into Carol's eyes and sneered with as much venom as possible. "Screw you," which I said. I glared at Jim and added, "Go to hell and taken with you." Carol's wistful expression disappeared, and Jim heard me and looked over with a glare. My lawyer tugged at my arm and tried to pull me away. "Come on, Mark, this won't help," he said with irritation. "Damn it, Mark, stop being childish. You have to help Jenny for her sake. This isn't easy for her either. She's your daughter, and she needs you now more than ever now." "Which, she's your daughter now, not mine," I informed bitterly. "Don't ever contact me again. You are Jenny, and keep your shithead stuff away from me, too. If you ever come near me again, I'll—" My lawyer shouted before I said any more. He pulled me away in a firm grasp and told me, "Just stop talking. Mark, it won't help. Wait until you calm down." Carol had tears in her eyes as she pleaded. "She's your daughter. Mark, she needs you right now. Screw you," I told her. I looked at Jim, who was staring back at me with obvious anger. "Screw you two, my former good friend. What a laugh." My lawyer dragged me away as I kept yelling, "Just go and screw my scum-sucking wife, you asshole. Screw all you want, you backstabbing creep." Everyone around us was watching and listening. An officer came out to see what was going on, and I finally stopped yelling. They pulled me away to my car. As my lawyer tried to explain the details of the judgment I had to pay her some amount each month for Jenny, and then I needed to come up with money for the house and a few other things. At some point, I just yanked my arm away and ran to my car, sobbing. The next day, the lock on our finances was released. Carol had taken half of our savings and investments, all the money I was saving for our family. There was so much for me, but not enough to do much more than survive. I received an official letter asking me to either move or provide her part of the equity of our house if I planned to sell it. I hastily sent back that I would sell it with a policeman in tow. Carol returned the day after and retrieved her car and all of her personal items. She also cleaned most of the furniture, which I had paid for, when she finished picking out her things. She tried to speak to me. I told her, "Screw you, 304, and walked away. The cop warned me to be civil, but I didn't care about him. When they walked out of the house, Carol had tears in her eyes. She got to the front yard and asked the cop to wait. She turned to me and said she wanted to talk. I went out onto the front yard and the cop stayed nearby. We just stood there for a moment in tense silence. I waited with an indifferent look as my wife tried to gather thoughts. "Please don't hate me, Mark," she said, wiping her tears. "I know you're not happy right now. It's not easy, but it will all work out in the end." I wanted to curse her out and say never, but instead I kept quiet and let her say her piece. "We weren't happy together, and you know it," she continued. "Things were getting worse between us, and I just couldn't go on." She stopped sniffling and wiped her eyes. She took a breath in her expression for more determined. "But Mark, what I really need to talk to you about is that I need your help with Jenny. She's not happy right now. Our divorce was hard on her." I snorted as if it wasn't my fault. Carol picked up on that, but ignored my insinuation. "Please just listen," she pleaded. "I spoke to her teacher and her schoolwork is suffering. Mark, she barely speaks to me now and doesn't see her friends anymore. She stays in her room nearly all the time. I'm worried, Jim, and I know she needs you, and I need your help with her so she can live a good life, a life with both parents. Jim said he won't. Don't mention him to me ever again," I snapped instantly. "Just go screw your wife stealing Carol, but never say he's mean to me. I never want to see or hear about him ever. He's a backstabbing liar, and you know it. He knew we were married, and he pursued you. He came across as friendly and nice. Then he seduced you with his money and screwed you behind my back. That's not the way it was, Mark. Not at all. That's exactly what happened," I countered angrily. "I thought he was my friend. A friend wouldn't do that. He's a cheater and a liar. And so are you." I said that a little too loud, and the cop moved closer, silently warning me to keep it civil. I noticed one of our neighbors had come out to look. Carol flinched at my remarks, but gave the cop a gesture that it was okay. "Please, Mark," Carol said, holding it together. "I really need your help with Jenny. She's upset. I've never seen her so hurt. Ask the a-hole to help. He's screwing you now. You're his problem. He's not her father. You are," I spat out bitterly. "She needs you more than ever. You must think I'm stupid. But I guess I am pretty stupid. At least I was." I continued. "The stupid, clueless husband that you found it so easy to cheat around on the idiot that thought my friend actually respected me and that my marriage was forever. I was an ignorant fool, Carol. So I see where you're coming from. If I was so stupid while we were married, why not now?" I laughed. Then my expression hardened. But now that I found out about you, I'm not so stupid and clueless. I now know how sneaky and underhanded you and the a-hole really are. How easily you lie. You guys must have had a great laugh about me, didn't you? You guys were screwing and I was such a trusting fool. That's in the past. You. Which now I hate you and wish you'd just disappear, I said bitterly. First you cheat with a friend, then you break up our family, and now you need my help. What a laugh! Never again. Which? Carol stiffened, staggered by my accusations. Please, Mark, we never thought that about you. I never wanted to hurt you, and neither did he? But that's all in the past. We're split up now, but we still have a daughter, and we have to get along for her sake. Think of Jenny. I looked at her like she was a piece of... Yeah, right, I snickered. Damn, you really are a piece of work. You cheating? 3 or 4, I said. You screw around on me and now you see the consequences. Not as much fun as you expected, is it? Which? Carol flinched and let out a little sob. The cop glared at me. Let me ask you a question. My faithless wife, I said in a reasonable tone. I just want to know how you can have a relationship with a man with no morals. That caught her off guard and she stopped sniffling. What? Jim is morals, she said defensively. A guy that screws his best friend's wife. I chuckled. First he seduces her, then carries on a sleazy affair behind his friend's back. Finally, he steals her away with his money, takes his daughter, and ruins his marriage. You call a guy like that moral? He's exactly the opposite. It was never, I interrupted. How can you ever trust a guy like that? Carol, I do trust him, she stammered. Off balance. Really? I asked sarcastically. A guy that steals his best friend's wife and daughter. A guy that uses his money to buy her love. Carol glanced at the cop and said tentatively, He's not like that, Mark. And you know it. And yes, I do trust him, but her eyes were darting around and I could see I struck a nerve. I don't see how, I went on unconfident. You know the kind of guy he is. A playboy. He has money and screws, lots of women. You're just another notch in a long line of easy holes. I can't tell you how many times he's bragged to his friends at the bar about his latest conquest. You're just the latest booty call for him. By the way, dear, have you been tested yet? Tested. She looked confused for STDs and AIDS. He gets around and he might have caught something nasty and passed it on to you for my protection. I had to get tested right after you left me for him. You know, he's quite a player and gets lots of strange. He's not like that anymore, Mark, she shot back. Sure he is, I replied. You saw him in action. Girls flock to that a whole. He has lots of girlfriends. I wouldn't be surprised if he's getting a little on the side. Do you know where he is right now? He's at work, she answered firmly. Is that what he told you? Yes, he's at work. And maybe he took the afternoon off for some strange. He works with a lot of hot girls, you know, like that one at his party, maybe screwing her after work. Then he comes home and whispers sweet nothings in your ear. You're a little too trusting. Carol, I know he still goes out alone and probably meets plenty of sexy girls, some younger and prettier than you. You're not getting any younger, you know. He may be getting tired of you already. He likes variety. It takes lots of hot women to keep him contented. Carol's eyes narrowed as I said with a laugh. Maybe he's getting a tuna right now. I wouldn't be surprised. You know he's done it before, don't you? You did get tested, right? Carol was getting frustrated by my insinuation. I guess she never thought about Jim and other women before. Now, no, I didn't. But he told me we're exclusive. He loves me, you know. Oh, right. I laughed at how naive she appeared. He tells that to a lot of women. Jim's a player, honey. You know his past. I guess he wouldn't tell you that he was screwing other women. Not yet, anyway. Her eyes suddenly had a bit of insecurity. My accusations were hitting home. Poor Carol wasn't as confident about a relationship as she was a few moments before. You say Jenny is having trouble dealing with our divorce. How will she feel when she finds out you ruined her family? For a guy that's cheating on you? That you abandoned her marriage, broke her father's heart, and messed up her life for a sleazy, lying homewrecker that'll really help her handle her issues? Get real. You fool. That a-hole isn't the ethical choir boy you think he is. Unless you think it's ethical for a guy to screw and steal his best friend's wife, remember that the next time he goes off for a so-called business trip, he doesn't mind screwing married women, or any woman for that matter. If he's got a stupid bimbo at home waiting for him, so much the better. Carol blinked and suddenly looked pale. Her eyes were nervous and darting around like she wasn't sure what to say. I kept on. "I've known him for quite a while now," I said, smiling wickedly. "You think he's a great guy, right? I know for a fact he cheated on his first wife, cheated on her multiple times. Why wouldn't he do that again? After all, he's not even married to you. You're just a sex buddy, an easy piece of meat. I bet he'll hold off cheating for a while, long enough to get his new clueless, gullible screw bunny, forget his wandering ways, then it's back to normal." Her eyes were flashing angrily. Now she knew what I was doing, and she didn't like it. "He's not like that anymore," she stated through tight lips. "Sure, he dated a lot before we were together," he told me. "He told you exactly what you want to hear, right?" I laughed. "Give the little woman a few lies to satisfy her, then go out and do what he wants. Boy, are you stupid. How will Jenny ever respect you after she finds out?" I let that harpoon sneak in, then snickered. We used to laugh about it. We'd go out drinking, and when he got a little high, he'd laugh and tell me what a stupid witch Martha was. His ex-wife, remember Carol, the woman he married? He didn't respect her one bit. He screwed around on her right from the beginning of their marriage. He used to laugh at how easy it was to cheat. It was a joke, and he played around on her for years now. Now he's got you another easy bimbo to screw around on. The pattern continues. That's a lie. She spat. Jim's a decent guy. I know it. Is that right? What do you think the next time he comes home late or you find lipstick on his collar? How about a number on a piece of paper in his pocket? Or when another woman calls him, or when he dances with some hot-looking chick at a club? Can you still trust him to be exclusive? My lovely ex-wife. He has a track record and it isn't good. He's a known cheater, a proven cheater. I doubt he'll be faithful to you after all. You're just a dumb play for him. If he couldn't be faithful to his wife, why should he go to the trouble to be faithful to you? I saw the cop out of the corner of my eye, openly smirking as he heard me. He knew exactly what I was doing, undercutting Carol's faith in him. She was caught between anger and confusion. She didn't believe I was right about Jim, but she couldn't just dismiss my arguments either. "Just give Jenny a call, will you?" she finally spat out. "She needs you now, Mark. You've got visitation this weekend. You can pick up Jenny from school Friday afternoon. Forget it. I said forget it. Jenny's your problem now. I'm not going to let you and that asshole jerk me around with visitation canceling at the last minute, asking to move our dates around for your convenience. Just forget it. I don't trust you. And by the way," I said as I pulled a check from my pocket. It was made out to Carol with a notation in the description line. "What's this? You have to pick her up, Mark. She wants to see you." "Forget the visitation," I told her. "Cold as ice. Here's a check for the full amount of my custodial responsibilities forever. It also covers partial payment to her college fund. Now that you and I are her parents, you deal with the consequences. I want no further contact with any of you." Carol took the check and gazed at it like it was poison. "You don't mean that." "I do," I said firmly, "but listen. Goodbye, Carol. You and your cheater deserve each other. Go to hell. You and Jim have a shitty life. Don't contact me again. Tell Jenny I'm sorry. She left me too. I really thought she loved me enough. I loved her more than anything. But seeing her often would just break my heart all over again. I'm moving on from both of you. Traitor. And if I ever see your asshole boyfriend again." I noticed the cop listening, so I didn't finish my threat. I didn't want any law enforcement officer hearing the threat made against them. Carol knew how I felt. I walked into the house and slammed the door, hearing my ex-wife sputtering in frustration. Nothing about her talk had gone as she expected. My cell phone had a dozen messages, and by the end of the day, I just deleted them and didn't bother listening. I went to my provider and got a new one. I guess it was Jenny or Carol that called, but I was in too much pain to listen to anything they had to say. The next couple of days, I finished my preparations for my new lifestyle. I went to the bank and pulled my money out of my accounts and opened a new one. There wasn't much money. After the check, I wrote to Carol. I then went to a real estate agent and put my home on the market. When he got the sign placed and left, I got out my spreader and spread Roundup over my entire yard. It would soon kill all the grass and shrubs, leaving the yard bare as a desert. I bought fish from the market and dropped them down the heating vents and turned on the heat to let the smell of rotting fish permeate the house. I was purposely ruining the house so it would sell cheap and she couldn't get a dime from it. Of course, neither would I, but I didn't care about that. I only wanted to screw my ex-wife from getting anything. The next day, I moved out what little furniture I had left, and rented a tiny, cheap studio apartment. It was located close to Jim's car dealership and not too far from my office. I sold my car for cash and pawned everything that even remotely reminded me of my ruined marriage. Then I threw myself into my work, making as much money as I could with overtime. My boss was happy, and I guess I was too. Working hard helped me forget about the traitors. The real estate agent called me and said my house wouldn't sell. It is a terrible smell. In the yard is a mess. Just lower the price as much as needed. Are you sure that's not really necessary, Mr. Kington? I mean, if we just put in some grass and get rid of the awful smell, I'm sure we can get full price. He said he obviously wanted a full price to enhance his commission. No, just dump the thing quicker, the better. But we might have to cut the price by as much as 30%, or even more. If we can't get rid of the smell, no problem. Just get it sold. Cut the price in half if you have to. Gosh. All right. If you're sure. The house eventually sold, but the price was so low we barely got anything out of it. I sent Carol the sales documents and a check for $500. I know she was shocked and expected far more. I didn't hear from her because she didn't have my number. I told her to contact me through my lawyer. He did call me and said Carol was upset with the price. I just laughed. He also said Jenny was calling him almost every week. "Don't you want to let her know how you are?" he asked me. "I know you're upset with your wife, but your daughter was nearly crying when I told her I couldn't release your number. They made their choice. Now they have to live with it." It was a few days since the house sold, and so far all my plans were working. I wasn't sure how much of my marital problems Carol's family knew, or Jim's either. So I composed an email explaining in explicit terms how my former best friend had seduced my cheating wife behind my back, how he stole her from me, broke up my family, and took my daughter. Of course, I embellished the tale quite a bit. None of the facts were wrong, and I made sure that everything was the truth. But the way I phrased the story made him sound like the biggest jerk in the world. It also made my ex-wife appear to be the biggest 304 on the planet. I didn't use those words, but the message was clear. He was a good-for-nothing creep, and she was a lying, cheating 304 that no one could ever trust. I gathered the email addresses of everyone knew Carol's family, her friends, Jim's family and friends, everyone from her church, in the club that Jim occasionally goes to. I also acquired the names of all the employees and staff at Jim's dealership and Carol's workplace, too. I even found some of his customers and included them. I pasted some unflattering remarks to Jim's Facebook page, his company's website, and any other person or entity I could think of that had any contact with them. I put the document I composed in an email to everyone, hit the send button, and let it fly. The next day, my lawyer called me upset about the emails and asked me to stop sending them. He said I could be sued for damages. I told him that I could never be sued for telling the truth and sent him a copy of the email for him to check. He said it was truthful, but a judge may not feel the same way. I tried to shelter Jenny and didn't send anything to her school, her friends or friends' parents, but I know they heard about it and Jenny was probably embarrassed at school when she was confronted by them. I went to a printer and had a bunch of leaflets made up about how I was screwed by Jim and my ex-wife. I didn't use my name, but they know who wrote it, if anyone confronted them again. I embellished the tale and made them out to be the most deplorable assholes ever. I went to Jim's dealership in the middle of the night and hung them on every tree, telephone pole, and light fixture I could find. I also went to every restaurant and put them up in the bathrooms. I knew some of their favorite places to hang out and made sure the bathrooms there had 1, 2. I even paid some chicks to put them up in the ladies' rooms in days. Nearly the entire town knew the details of their sordid affair. I made sure everyone knew Jim was a salesman in his dealership, and to avoid such a sleazy creep. By this time, my lawyer was fielding calls from all over. He was upset with me, so I just dropped him as my lawyer. He was pleased I did. I noticed later that some of the signs had been taken down, but I didn't care. I had some left and pasted them about town, even putting them around Jim's house, which I knew pissed them off. After the divorce, I was nearly broke, but now that I was working overtime, I was making some serious money. My cheap apartment cost very little, and I had so few financial obligations that my net worth began to increase rapidly. My paychecks were quite fat. Now, in a few months, I'd saved quite a bit of money, and more was coming in every week. It's amazing how much money an accountant can make working 14-hour days with nothing to spend it on. I hired a private investigator. I didn't need the expensive surveillance plan you offered. Instead, I just had him check up on Jim and my ex-wife's schedule so I'd know where they were at any particular time of day. When I had a grip on their routines, I had enough to start on the next part of my plan. Jim Simpson was well off, but he wasn't filthy rich. With my campaign against them, the rumors about the cheaters' despicable acts were now common. It must have cut into Jim's income because he sold cars, and anyone knew was leery about buying a car from him. Car salesmen already had a bad image, and this was worse than most, as his income was squeezed. His ability to maintain an expensive lifestyle was also diminishing. Carol's work at the art gallery was also having trouble. It seems that many of the folks who used to frequent her place didn't want to deal with a cheating, lying wife. I'm sure the wives of the men that frequented their store didn't want their husbands interacting with a sexy divorcee with a known track record of screwing other men. Carol also used to belong to a gym, which was how she managed to keep up her sumptuous figure. But as her and Jim's income shrunk, the gym membership had to go. Jim got rid of the BMW but kept the fancy SUV. At some point, I wondered how he would manage the mortgage on his big house. I hoped that soon that would be hit as well. I did go out on occasion and meet women. It was more to just get my mind off of work than any hope of romance. Carol seemed to have killed that. I never had luck dating any of them and really didn't care. I'd get some of the women drunk and pay them to call Jim's house when I knew he wasn't home. I made it sound like a teenage prank. And it wasn't hard to get these women to go along. I even listened when she'd call and ask to speak to Jim. Carol would answer and tell her he wasn't home. The girl would say something like, "Just tell him Kathy said hi, or let him know I had a great time last week, or if I was really evil. Let him know that Mary will be ready tomorrow," and suspicious, but vague insinuation. Carol would simply slam down the phone, but it was putting doubt in her mind about Jim's faithfulness. After all, neither of them were faithful, and she knew it. I also had some guys call Jim's dealership and complain about him. Some of the stories mentioned his history of cheating, how underhanded he seemed, anything that put doubt in his boss's mind. I even had a couple of guys complain that Jim was hitting on their wives. Of course, it was all fantasy, but it must have done the trick because I heard that Jim was changing jobs. I used the same game against Carol. I know they probably figured it was me behind all this, but with their histories, the seeds of doubt were planted. I spent most of my time working, and since I wasn't dating, I had free time when I wasn't in the office. I spent time online and began to learn about short-term trading and stocks and options. Most people would never be interested in trading online, but I began to realize how much I could make with a little bit of knowledge. It was simple to set up an online account with a brokerage firm. They had a training page on their website that I began to study. The philosophy of short-term trading was a simple concept, but it did involve risk. The online training sessions taught me how to limit the risk and maximize the rewards. I was amazed at how much money could be made with so little cash to start with. Learning to use the trading techniques took a little time at first, and I did lose money on some trades. But as time went on, I learned more and began to make some serious money, more than I was making it. My job as an accountant in 2 months. I had quite a bit of money to play with, so I took the plunge and got into options trading. This meant that I could use a small amount of cash to leverage into a large amount of profit during my off hours. I spent a lot of time online setting up trades that would bear fruit in less than 1 day. A couple of months later, my account value was deep into 6 figures. It was after work, rather late in the evening when I was drinking in a bar. I had only stopped in for a moment, so I was surprised when Jim and Carol burst into the place together and confronted me. I guess they found out where I was living and had me followed. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Jim yelled angrily. Everybody in the place turned to see what the commotion was about. "When a big 6 feet 2 inches guy's yelling, it's hard not to notice, you asshole," he shouted, pointing his finger at me. "I know it was you screwing me over." Carol was next to him, nodding her head, glaring at me like she wanted to beat me up. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said innocently. Jim's face would be red. "You asshole! I should kick your ass, you jerk," Carol added angrily. "It's you, isn't it? You're messing with Jim's business and my job." "Damn it, Mark. You're a real asshole, you know." I just sat there smirking at them and laughed. "You two are delusional." "You're screwing up my work," you dumb Jim shouted. "You're screwing my wife," I told him, smiling. "I'm not your wife, you asshole," Carol screamed. "I left your sorry ass for Jim, and he's a better man than you'll ever be." Jim jumped in yelling, "You better cut this out right now or I'm going to sue your sorry ass." I acted cool as a cucumber while they were nearly out of control. They must have had someone following me to know I was here. I didn't plan this, but it was working out in my favor. I began to see how the situation could help me. "What for?" I asked Jim calmly. I did nothing. "You're crazy, Carol," I screeched. "See you for all those leaflets and those nasty emails. I know your ego was crushed when I left you, but you know you're a loser anyway." "Leaflets? What leaflets?" I laughed. "Can't take the truth. I guess the truth hurts when you're nothing but a lying, cheating 304. And he's just a backstabbing loser that can't get his own woman. He has to steal someone else's like his friend's wife." "Why you?" Jim started to say before Carol grabbed his arm and forcefully pulled him back. The big guy was pissed, more than I've ever seen him before. "I lost my job," she said. "They fired me. Damn it. And Jim's having trouble too. He had to change jobs, and that's not going well either. You have to cut this out." "Mark," I laughed. "I guess people don't want to be around the lying skank." Jim's face was twisted with rage. He was on the verge of losing control. "You cut this off," before he started to say, "You what?" I go, "And then you steal my wife and my family." "Oh, right. You already did that. You screwed up. Just shut your mouth." "Loser." Everyone around us was watching in silence. No one expected a small rat like me to confront such a big guy. There were smirks all around, and the manager was making his way toward us. I had to move quickly. "I mean it, Mark," Carol warned angrily. "Stop this or else." I looked her in the eye and asked, "Has he started cheating on yet? Carol? He has a history of it. You know, just ask Martha." That was the last word I got to say before the big guy hit me with a piledriver fist to my jaw. The heavy punch drove me back into the bar, and it nearly knocked me out before me, or anyone could react. Jim jumped over and started punching me, flailing away with both hands. "I'll kill you," he cried as I tried to deflect his punches. He got in 2 or 3 good ones, 2 to my face and another to my ribs. I heard something snap before the guys around us could react by the time they pulled him off me. I was in serious pain. My nose was bloody. My ribs were hurting bad. But I smiled because it couldn't have worked out better. It took 3 guys to hold him down, and Carol was screaming and crying at the same time. Someone called the police, and they were there in minutes. I just lay there bleeding and looking like I was in pain. But I was laughing inside, and how this would play out. Of course, Jim was arrested for assault. They took him away in handcuffs, with Carol sobbing as she followed him out the door. The ambulance was called for me. I knew I would be okay, but I let the medical folks take me out on a stretcher to make it look as bad as possible. I even had them taking pictures of me as they attended to me. It would be fuel for my lawsuit. As you guessed, I hired the most ruthless lawyer I could find and pressed charges against the asshole. Carol left me dozens of crying, sobbing messages filled with cursing. I couldn't have been happier. It took a day before Jim got out on bail, but his employment was in serious jeopardy. He was still new on his job and probably on probation. Having a big barroom brawler on the payroll and a cheater to boot wasn't an asset to his company. After all the bad press, he was finally let go and had to find another job. He never did find work. A month or so later, Jim was tried and convicted of assault and even attempted murder. I made sure to include that charge. He served 3 months in jail only on weekends so he could still work, but he had to pay a big fine and was on probation for years. Carol was crushed. Her new boyfriend now had a record, and finding a job would be even more difficult than before. My injuries healed pretty quick. Jim had to pay for my medical bills. I also took out a restraining order against him. Another blow in my favor. I heard later that he was selling his house. Guess it was hard to keep up the payments without a full-time job. Jim found odd jobs for cash while he was searching for work. Carol got another job, but it didn't pay much. The 3 of them moved into a cheap 2-bedroom apartment to save money. He also got rid of his SUV and purchased a couple of shitty cars to get around. Life is tough. I let things simmer for a while. I kept having women call the house when Jim was at work and Carol was home. Occasionally, some guy would call asking for her. When Jim was home, I tried to have them call when Jimmy was in school or was out so she wasn't involved. I don't know if it was having any effect on the cheaters, but I was hoping it would. My PA kept tabs on the couple's work issues for me. When Jim tried to apply for another job, I made sure his prospective employers knew exactly the kind of guy they were considering. It took him months to finally get a mechanic job at some world-class car repair shop that hired other ex-cons. So I guess Jim's record didn't bother them. Carol was working as a waitress at a Denny's, but I'm sure she wasn't making much. By this time, I had saved up a shitload of cash. I also had quite a nice income with all the overtime I worked. I was banking at least 10 grand a month, meaning it was time to get on with the next part of my plan. When I heard that Jim had to sell his house, I went to his old neighborhood and drove by his old home, the huge one he had before. All the trouble. I was happy to see a for sale sign on it. Through my lawyer, I put in a low bid for the house and was stunned when they accepted my offer. Apparently, the housing market wasn't doing all that well and they needed to dump the property in a couple of weeks. We had a quick closing and I moved in. The house was beautiful, 4 bedrooms, 3 full bathrooms, a formal dining room, and a landscaped yard. I moved into the master bedroom, fully appreciating the fact that this was where my ex-friend had seduced and fornicating with my cheating wife. It gave me a perverse sense of pleasure to know that he'd never enjoy this bedroom or the rest of this huge, lovely house again. I cashed in some stocks and began to decorate the house to make sure the result was perfect. I hired a professional interior decorator. She and I had a meeting where I expressed what I wanted. She asked about the budget, and I told her that I would be very generous but not wasteful. I wanted the place to reflect a home, not a showpiece for a magazine. I also had her use some of the photos of my old house as a template for the decor, at over $200,000 worth of furniture and decor. The woman did a great job. I also hired a landscaper and he fixed up the yard. It had been a real showpiece, but with all the problems, it was a little overgrown. In the weeks since the cheaters moved out, he also put in a hot tub on the deck and fixed up the patio with a brick barbecue. It looked great after all the updating. I believe I nearly doubled the value of the home. I wasn't going to sell. Not right now. I had other plans. It had been months since I spoke to Jenny and I missed her. Something awful. I was still stunned by her choosing the cheaters over me, but eventually my need to see her overwhelmed. My pride. I called her cell phone one afternoon when I knew she'd be home. She couldn't contact me because my lawyer didn't give out my number. I was hoping she still had the same number, and I was right. She probably had caller ID, and I knew my number wouldn't be recognized. I just hoped she would answer. Hello? Hi, Jenny. It's me, your dad. Dad? Really? Yes, honey, I miss you so much. I'm so sorry I haven't seen you. I guess I was just too broken up about what happened. I'd love to see you again if you'll have me. I can't believe it's really you. Yes, Jenny, it's me. And I miss you like crazy. I miss you too. I thought you didn't want me anymore. That's not true. I know I was stupid for not seeing you. I was just too upset about the divorce. But I'm better now. I would like to have you over to my place, if you're free. Maybe this weekend. Sure. I have to check with Mom. She's pretty mad at you right now. I know she is. I can't help that. But don't worry about her. I just want to see you and catch up. Maybe we can go to a concert or something. Anything you want. Okay, let me call you back. Is this your number? Yes, you can call me anytime. It's so wonderful just hearing your voice. I love you, Jenny. I heard her utter sob as she said, Me too, Dad. She hung up, and I was on top of the world. An hour later, I got another call. You asshole, she said when I answered. Nice to hear you too, Carol. You go months without any contact with your daughter. She snapped at me angrily. The poor girl has just about stopped crying every night for you, and now her cowardly father decides to show up and break her heart again. I won't break her heart, Carol. Not like you broke mine. Well, you're right. I want to see her. I need to see her. There was a long pause of silence. Carol, are you still there? Yes. I want to see Jenny. How about this weekend? Is she free? Another long pause, then I guess so. Great. What time can I pick her up? You're really a jerk. You know, Mark, I hope you're serious. Jenny needs you. Mark, you're not going to build up her hopes, get angry, and just disappear and break her heart again. Are you? No way. I've learned my lesson. I miss her and I need to have her in my life. I can pick her up anytime. You say, Carol, please don't make me beg. All right. How about 6 o'clock on Friday? You're not going to disappoint her again. I hope no. 6 o'clock on Friday. I'll be there. Thanks, Carol. Okay, bye. Goodbye. I spent the week getting the house ready. Jenny was astonished when I pulled up in a black limo to pick her up. We hugged for nearly 5 minutes. Carol was watching us from the doorway with tears in her eyes. I didn't see the asshole, but I could tell that Carol was surprised to see the limo. After the driver opened the door and put Jenny's suitcase in the trunk, Carol came out and squeezed my arm. "You better not disappoint her, Mark. She's been looking forward to this all week long. If you upset her, I'll kill you." I wanted to say that she already did when she left me, but I didn't. "Don't worry, Carol," I told her softly. "Now that everything between us is sorted out, I just want to help Jenny any way I can." She gave me a long, hard look and then walked back to her tiny apartment. Jenny was squealing with excitement as we drove away. We had a wonderful weekend. Jenny was flabbergasted to find that her old residence where she and Carol lived with Jim was now my house. I took her to a very upscale restaurant and let her order anything she wanted. On Saturday, we went to some boy band concert. I never heard of them, but some woman from work told me about them and I got tickets. Jenny was thrilled. She also loved the hot tub on the back deck. It made me think about getting a swimming pool installed. I had a catered barbecue party with a few friends of mine from work. They had kids around Jenny's age and they all got along great. I spent a pretty penny on this weekend, but it was well worth it. By the time I took her home, my daughter was chattering away about the weekend, even making plans for the next time she came over. The weekend was a rousing success. I haven't been so happy since before my divorce. Monday evening, I got another call from Carol. "You bought Jim's house?" She cried with obvious distress. "You know, he took a big cut in the value of that house. He never wanted to sell, and he's really upset to find out it was you that undercut his price like that." "So he thinks I cheated him?" I replied, accentuating the word cheated. Carol didn't miss the insinuation. "So payback's a witch, right?" she said bitterly before I could. "He wasn't forced to sell. I told her I heard it was a distress sale, so in a way I did him a favor buying it." "You're one cold-hearted creep, Mark. I never thought you were like that." "I didn't used to be," I replied. "I used to be a nice, average guy, pretty trusting and naive. See what that got me? Then a couple of sleazy cheaters did me wrong and really opened my eyes. Thanks for that." After a long pause, she hung up. The next couple of months, Jenny spent almost every weekend with me, and I couldn't have been happier. The house that I bought from Jim was now mine, and with her around, it really began to feel like a home. It was much larger and more luxurious than the one we had before. Unlike our old house, even though I knew what went on here, this one didn't have any bad memories for me. I just forgot about who owned it before and enjoyed the amenities. Of course, Jenny loved it. She said she kept telling her mom how much fun she had with me. Jim was spending the weekends in jail, but all week he had to listen to my daughter gushing about how I now lived in his house and how fixed up it was. Carol could see that Jim hated hearing that and had to tell her not to talk about it anymore because it upset him so much. Tough. It was a couple of months later when I picked Jenny up. Jim was in jail, leaving Carol by herself. Last week, Jenny asked if her mother could join us sometime, and I agreed it would be nice. When I pulled up and she ran down the stairs of her apartment, I took her bag and told Jenny to go invite her mom to have dinner with us. She was elated and ran back inside to get her. A few minutes later, Carol appeared at the doorway with a scowl. She sent Jenny to the limo to pack her suitcase and approached me on the stairway. She had me warily and asked, "What kind of game are you trying to pull?" "Mark, there's no agenda, Carol." I told her honestly. "Jenny asked about having you with us sometime. I thought it might be nice, despite all the bad history between us. I know you're a good mother. You may not believe this, but I miss you." Carol flinched. My remark startled her, and she turned away for a moment. "I know you're with Jim now. I get it. But time marches on, Carol. We used to get along as a family, and Jenny and I would like to have you with us. If you're just going to be here alone all weekend, why not spend it with me and your daughter? I won't bite, I promise." She tried to hold back a smile at my remark, but wasn't entirely successful. "I don't think Jim would appreciate me going with you." "You're not going with me?" I reminded her. "We have Jenny to chaperone, so there will be no funny business with her watching. Just a nice family meal and some pleasant conversation. No pressure. Carol, but I think you'll enjoy it." She gave me a hard stare before exhaling hard. "Oh, all right. I guess it won't hurt to just have a meal. Give me a minute." The evening turned out wonderful. I have to admit, despite her betrayal, I still loved Carol. I just can't turn it off like a switch. Probably never will. She was a lousy, deceitful wife, and I knew there's no going back. At the same time, I was a crummy father. After abandoning my daughter for so long, I admit I still think fondly of her sometimes. Unfortunately, I can never trust her as a wife, but that doesn't mean I didn't enjoy her company that night. I could tell the past few months had been hard on her. She had gained weight. Her expression was rather harsh, and the fine wrinkles around her eyes and mouth seemed to have deepened a bit. But in my eyes, she was still beautiful. The most excited was Jenny, who babbled on and on about how nicely the house was fixed up. As I got dinner ready, she took her mother around the backyard and showed her all the upgrades, the refinished deck, the hot tub, the gazebo, the flower gardens. She even told her about my plans to install a swimming pool. Then she took Carol on a tour around the house. I wasn't there to witness the two of them, but when Carol returned to the kitchen, she was misty-eyed and there were tears in her eyes. Maybe she was missing what she used to have before I began ruining her boyfriend's career. "You've really done a lot with this house," Carol said over dinner. "How can you afford all this on an accountant's salary?" "I don't have anyone to spend my money on," I replied when a sympathetic look appeared on her face. I added quickly, and I made some investments that turned out well for me. "I'm glad you approve. I was hoping you'd like the decor. I wanted it to feel like a home Monday evening." I got another call from Carol. "You bought Jim's house?" she cried with obvious distress. "You know, he took a big cut in the value of that house. He never wanted to sell, and he's really upset to find out it was you that undercut his price like that." "So he thinks I cheated him?" I replied, accentuating the word cheated. Carol didn't miss the insinuation. "So payback's a witch, right?" she said bitterly before I could. "He wasn't forced to sell. I told her I heard it was a distress sale, so in a way, I did him a favor buying it. You're one cold-hearted creep, Mark. I never thought you were like that." "I didn't used to be," I replied. "I used to be a nice, average guy, pretty trusting and naive. See what that got me? Then a couple of sleazy cheaters did me wrong and really opened my eyes. Thanks for that." After a long pause, she hung up. The next couple of months, Jenny spent almost every weekend with me, and I couldn't have been happier. The house that I bought from Jim was now mine, and with her around, it really began to feel like a home. It was much larger and more luxurious than the one we had before. Unlike our old house, even though I knew what went on here, this one didn't have any bad memories for me. I just forgot about who owned it before and enjoyed the amenities. Of course, Jenny loved it. She said she kept telling her mom how much fun she had with me. Jim was spending the weekends in jail, but all week he had to listen to my daughter gushing about how I now lived in his house and how fixed up it was. Now. Carol could see that Jim hated hearing that and had to tell her not to talk about it anymore because it upset him so much. Though it was a couple of months later when I picked Jenny up, Jim was in jail, leaving Carol by herself. Last week, Jenny asked if her mother could join us sometime, and I agreed it would be nice. When I pulled up and she ran down the stairs of her apartment, I took her bag and told Jenny to go invite her mom to have dinner with us. She was elated and ran back inside to get her. A few minutes later, Carol appeared at the doorway with a scowl. She sent Jenny to the limo to pack her suitcase and approached me on the stairway. She had me wearily and asked, "What kind of game were you trying to pull?" "Mark, there's no agenda, Carol," I told her honestly. "Jenny asked about having you with us sometime. I thought it might be nice despite all the bad history between us. I know you're a good mother. You may not believe this, but I miss you." Carol flinched. My remark startled her, and she turned away for a moment. "I know you're with Jen now. I get it. But time marches on, Carol. We used to get along as a family, and Jenny and I would like to have you with us. If you're just going to be here alone all weekend, why not spend it with me and your daughter? I won't bite. I promise." She tried to hold back a smile at my remark, but wasn't entirely successful. "I don't think Jim would appreciate me going with you." "You're not going with me?" I reminded her. "We have Jenny to chaperone, so there will be no funny business with her watching. Just a nice family meal and some pleasant conversation. No pressure, Carol, but I think you'll enjoy it." She gave me a hard stare before exhaling hard. "Oh, all right. I guess it won't hurt to just have a meal. Give me a minute." The evening turned out wonderful. I have to admit, despite her betrayal, I still love Carol. I just can't turn it off like a switch, probably never will. She was a lousy, deceitful wife, and I know there's no going back. At the same time, I was a crummy father after abandoning my daughter for so long. I admit I still think fondly of her sometimes. Unfortunately, I can never trust her as a wife. But that doesn't mean I didn't enjoy her company that night. I could tell the past few months have been hard on her. She has gained weight. Her expression was rather harsh, and the fine wrinkles around her eyes and mouth seemed to have deepened a bit. But in my eyes, she was still beautiful. The most excited was Jenny, who babbled on and on about how nicely the house was fixed up as I got dinner ready. She took her mother around the backyard and showed her all the upgrades, the refinished deck, the hot tub, the gazebo, the flower gardens. She even told her about my plans to install a swimming pool. Then she took Carol on a tour around the house. I wasn't there to witness the two of them, but when Carol returned to the kitchen, she was misty-eyed and there were tears in her eyes. Maybe she was missing what she used to have before I began ruining her boyfriend's career. "You've really done a lot with this house, Carol," I said over dinner. "How can you afford all this on an accountant's salary?" "I don't have anyone to spend my money on," she replied with a sympathetic look, "and I made some investments that turned out well for me." "I'm glad you approve. I was hoping you'd like the decor. I wanted it to feel like a home." I looked over and her daughter, who was gobbling down a piece of prime rib. "Now it does." After dinner, we had apple pie and ice cream with our coffee, and I took them out on the deck and put on a cheesy fireworks demonstration with some inexpensive fireworks I picked up. It wasn't that great, but Jenny squealed with enthusiasm as they shot up, exploded, and burst into a dazzling display of colors for a few precious moments. It was almost like we were family again. Unfortunately, all good things come to an end. I invited Carol to spend the night with us. I let her know that she would have her own room, and there was nothing romantic in my offer. She politely declined, so I got her a cab and sent her home. Work kept me extremely busy for the rest of the month. I was still making money on my investments, but I kept working to keep my mind from wondering about my lack of a love life. I could have paid for escorts to get off, but truthfully, I really didn't want meaningless sex without romance. I wanted a solid relationship with my daughter, and if I could get along with Carol, so much the better. It was Jenny's call one weeknight that shocked me that she cried, sniffling Jenny. "What's the matter? It's Mom. She's crying. She's in the bedroom and won't let me in." "What happened?" "They had an argument. I think she found out Jim's cheating on her. She's a mess. Bad. Can you come over?" So my prediction came true. The sleazy scumsucker's true colors finally came out. "Where is he right now?" "They had a big argument in the bedroom," Jenny said, her voice cracking. "I was so scared." Mom was screaming at him. There was lots of banging. Afterward, he came out and slammed the door hard. He was cursing as he left the house. "I think he drove away. I'm so scared. Bad. Just stay there, Jenny. I'll be right over." I called the police and reported a possible domestic abuse. They met me at Carol's apartment and we knocked on the door. My ex-wife answered after a long time, looking terrible. Jenny ran out and into my arms. I hugged her tight as she sobbed into my chest. "Thank you for coming, Dad," she gushed. Carol went to the kitchen and sat down as the police officer questioned her. I looked for any signs of abuse. She didn't admit to any, and I didn't see any visible bruises. But that didn't mean you didn't hurt her. I asked the officer if I could have a word with her alone, and he agreed. "Carol," I said softly, "are you in any danger? Would you like to come over to my house for a while? Just until things cool off." "Oh, Mark, I don't know what to say. She bluebird. I don't want to impose. You're not imposing. You can sleep in the extra bedroom. Jenny will be there too. We can take care of you. I care about you, Carol, and Jenny loves you. I don't want to leave you here with him. You and I had issues, but just forget about that. I want you to be safe. Please come with us. Jenny and I are begging you." "Okay?" She whispered so softly I could barely hear her. "Thank you, Carol," I said with feeling. "Don't worry about anything. Let's get some things packed for you. If you forget something, we can buy it." She sobbed a little, then whispered, "Thank you, Mark." The police had to write up a report. But since Carol said there was no abuse, Jim didn't have to come in for questioning. Lucky for him, there wasn't. He's still on probation for the assault on me and would have been back in jail again over the next few weeks. Carol basically moved back in with me. She was crushed by her boyfriend's treachery and broke off her relationship with him. We talked about it one time. She said he was banging the receptionist at the car repair shop where he worked. It sounded so typical of that asshole. He never could keep his lust in his pants. Over the next few weeks, I did everything I could to provide a safe, loving environment for Jenny and for Carol, too. I know she appreciated it, and Jenny couldn't have been happier. She loved having both parents home every night. Her attitude became better. Her performance at school improved, and her social life did too, as boys began showing up around the house a few times. We ate dinner together and went to a movie sometimes. I loved it when Carol would cook for us. Having a delicious dinner waiting for me was great. It made me leave work on time whenever I could. There wasn't any physical contact between Carol and me. She was still distressed about her situation, and I knew how I felt when she let me down from the start. I made it clear that we were just friends, but I wanted her safe, and having her there with Jenny and me made it seem like a real home. Now, I found her a job with a client of mine. Later, we found her an apartment nearby. Most of the money she got from her divorce was spent on bills and Jim's legal expenses. She did have some furniture that she got out of Jim's apartment, but it wasn't enough. I gave her a coffee maker for a housewarming present. Jenny was sad she was leaving, and Carol said she misses a lot, but it was time for her to be on her own. Living with me would only stir up unpleasant memories for both of us. She needed to start fresh. She soon started dating. The guy she's dating seemed pretty cool. Jenny said he spoke nicely to her and she liked him. I guess that's as good a reference as I could hope for, as Carol pulled away from me. Jenny and I grew closer. I think I depend on her as much as she does on me. I watched her grow from a little girl to a sweet adolescent into an intelligent, responsible young lady. She's taking advanced courses at school because we're starting the process to find a college for her. Her grades are doing well, and there are a number of universities interested in her. She's a wonderful daughter. I couldn't ask for better, and I'm incredibly proud of her. My love life isn't very robust, but there are some women who have expressed interest in an aging old accountant. I have them over some time so Jenny can give me her appraisal. So far, none have turned into a solid romance, but I'm still hoping there's someone for me out there. Only time will tell. In the meantime, I'm busy and successful in my work, and I'm enjoying raising Jenny for the short time we have before she leaves for school. I have to say, things turn out better than I thought they would a few years ago. Divorce sucks, but life goes on. Here's the next story. I met Jane while serving on the USNS Comfort, one of the Navy's Mercy-class hospital ships. Immediately after the 2010 Haiti earthquake, the Comfort ship was in the Caribbean, providing assistance to the victims. I was a second lieutenant. There were 2 months left before the end of my 6-year service period, and I was ready to receive an honorable discharge and return to the civilian world. Everything worked out as well as possible. The time spent as an officer commanding a team of assistant machinists gave me ample opportunities for a decent civilian career. Jane was a recent college graduate with a nursing degree, a civilian volunteer on the ship helping with recovery after operations. We met when my team was troubleshooting her room. I immediately admired her beauty. Height 5'8", 172.7 centimeters. Slim, athletic build. She played women's soccer at school and college. Long blonde hair, blue eyes, and the most beautiful smile I have seen in recent years. I tried to start a conversation with her without seeming intrusive and without interfering with her performance of her duties. There are strict rules on the ship regarding the fraternization policy, but over the next few weeks we had the opportunity to have lunch together several times. I've spent enough time with Jane to want to get to know her better. She probably felt the same way because she gave me her parents' address and her mobile phone number. We agreed to meet after my demobilization a week after I retired. I knocked on the door of her parents' house in a Philadelphia suburb. Jane's parents, Paul and Rose, greeted me with friendly smiles. The four of us cooked a delicious homemade dinner. Rose is an excellent cook. Paul is an Air Force veteran who served in the 60s. We dropped the interspecies rivalry and immediately became friends. Paul even gave me a tip to work in Philly. The tip turned into an offer that turned into a career. I must admit that my relationship with Jane developed much more slowly than I would have liked. Rose and Paul were old-school Catholics, and since Jane lived at home, the possibilities for realizing our growing love for each other were limited. Jane wasn't a virgin. She had 2 steady boyfriends in college. It took 4 months before Jane and I finally ended up in my bed. It was pretty vanilla, but wonderful. Jane's previous boyfriends apparently were not very imaginative in bed. She was shocked by some of the things we did that first weekend. Although, as I said, Everything was pretty vanilla. Jane and I got married 10 months after I moved to Pennsylvania. We both had great jobs, and we decided that we would wait a few years before starting a family. We used these years to accumulate good capital for a new home and give Jane the opportunity to become a full-time mom when our children arrived. We also used these years to enjoy each other's company emotionally. We spent our honeymoon on the Caribbean island of St. Martin. I managed to rent a 35 feet 10.7 AM sailing yacht in Morocco, the capital of French St. Martin. We went around the island and went to Anguilla and St. Bart. Jane surprised me by the fact that she spent most of her time between harbors sunbathing on the deck of the yacht. It's kind of stupid to put on clothes when no one sees us, isn't it? The third night on the yacht was probably the most magical in my life. Jane and I finished the delicious red snapper dish, which was accompanied by a wonderful bottle of Burgundy Chardonnay. We spread a blanket on the deck and stared at a million stars. 2 shooting stars streaked across the sky. We made love, and when we were done, we fell asleep in each other's arms. The only ones in the world that night. 2 days later, we sailed into the bay at Orient Bay. We reached the shore, and Jane was stunned to find that we were on the nudist beach of Orient Bay, Rick. Everyone is naked here. Jane was wearing the smallest bikini, and she was still too dressed. I decided to shock Jane and took off my swimming trunks. "Rick, what are you doing?" "When in Rome." The expression, "when in Rome, do as the Romans." When in Rome, do as the Romans. Well, not me. We were walking along the beach along the naturist resort. Jane in a bikini, me in my birth costume. By the time we returned to the resort's restaurant, Papa Papago, Jane had given up the top but remained in her underpants. It was a unique experience. I swam to the boat and took our towels, suntan cream, and money. We took 2 sun loungers on the beach and a bucket of beer. Jane didn't take off her panties. Some parts of the body are only for my husband's eyes. That was her only comment about it. It was a beautiful day. After a couple of hours, we swam back to the boat and vowed to return someday. A day spent in the sun when people looked at my beautiful wife, topless, boosted my libido. Jane and I spent the evening on a yacht making love. We anchored at the pier on Pinnell Island, after which we sailed back to Margot and flew home. In the 6 years since our honeymoon before Hurricane Irma, Jane and I have returned to the island 9 times. We either rented a sailing yacht or stayed in a condominium on Orient Beach, but never visited a naturist resort. Although from time to time we sunbathed on Club Orient Beach. Jane never changed her mind about total nudity, but the bottom of her bikini was significantly reduced, sometimes to the size of a thong, while the treasures remained hidden. We had already booked our 10th visit when the trouble happened. The photos of the destruction that we found on the internet reminded us of what we saw after the disaster in Haiti. Words cannot describe the destruction. A month after Irma, Jane was working in one of the clinics in the city when she learned about the opportunity to help rebuild a clinic in the vicinity of Margot, in the same nonprofit charity organization in which she worked as a volunteer in Haiti. Jane almost attacked me when I walked through the front door of our apartment. "Rick, can you believe this? They need help on St. Martin. They are asking for qualified medical professionals to launch a new clinic in Margot. I've already talked to my boss. He said he would approve my vacation." "Wait a minute, Jane. For how long is this calculated? From 3 to 5 months. And you didn't think we should talk about this first? Of course you do. It just didn't occur to me that you wouldn't approve. I didn't sign anything and I didn't make any commitments. I'm sorry if I was a little hasty. I was just so excited when I received the letter today. What about our plans to start a family? You stopped taking the pills last month. Can we postpone this for a few months? Just for a few months? I promise we'll be careful until I get back. And until then, we'll use condoms. Please." It took more than an hour before I finally agreed with Jane. It was more important than both of us. The people we knew and loved needed her help. I took a few days off to accompany Jane to St. Martin's and help her settle into her new place. We landed on the island on Thursday and rented a car. Although we rented a room for the weekend, our first stop was at the charity's office, the second at the apartment where Jane will live. We met Jane's neighbor, Allison Parker. We invited her to dinner. And the more I talked to Allison, the more I liked her. She seemed responsible, happily married in her early 30s. By the time we dropped Allison off at the apartment and headed to Orient Bay to check into our room, my anxiety level had halved. On Friday morning, Jane and I went to the beach to go for a run. As we were running along the beach, a man was running towards us. We exchanged smiles and small waves, nothing unusual, just the politeness that fitness enthusiasts exchange. Jane and I ran to the end of the bay and turned back. Halfway there, we approached the same runner. This time he stopped. Bonjour, good afternoon. To my surprise, Jane stopped. Bonjour. The man held out his hand to me. Are you Americans? I returned his handshake. How did you guess? Just a wild guess. The clothes, the friendliness. When I greeted you, the accent. My name is Jean-Paul. I'm Richard. This is my wife, Jane. Jean-Paul held out his hand to her. It's a pleasure. It's nice to meet new people. After Irma, the beach has become so deserted, especially at this time of year. Jean-Paul stared at Jane for too long, but it was hard to blame him as she looked spectacular in her bra and running shorts. When Jean-Paul asked how he planned to spend the day, I was annoyed that Jane informed us of our intention to visit a nudist beach. Of course, he showed up on the same day. He moved the chaise longue to the other side of Jane from me. He made sure she was watching when he pulled down his pants. He organized a special exhibition smearing himself with sunscreen, especially there for the next hour. He told us the story of his life, and I tried my best not to fall asleep. It turned out that he was a French national living in St. Martin to help rebuild the school and other damaged public buildings. Local civil engineers were overwhelmed by the scale of the projects needed, and his Paris firm sent him here to help the locals. When asked about his family, he replied that he was a bachelor. No wife, no children. I bought the first beer, and when I came back from the pub, Jean-Paul was lying on his stomach and looking at me with a smirk on his face. Half an hour later, Jean-Paul offered to buy a second portion and left while he was gone. I tried to engage Jane in a conversation that had nothing to do with our interlocutor. Just as I was asking Jane about dinner, Jean-Paul came back with our beer. Jane turned to Jean-Paul. We were just discussing dinner. Maybe you can recommend a place. Our favorite restaurant closed after Irma. Let me take you to my new favorite place in Morocco. This will be my treat. I couldn't hide my annoyance, but Jane replied before I declined his offer. That's very nice of you. Can we pick you up on the way? That's how we ended our Friday night with the Frenchman. Dinner was good, but I could have done without Jean-Paul's condescending attitude. Like many Frenchmen, he seemed to have a certain dislike for the Americans, especially our military. More than once, he made snide remarks about the bad decisions made by the United States. I bit my tongue before agreeing with him. I wanted to say that we made a particularly bad decision when we drove the Nazis out of France together with the British, but I held my tongue because he could use my words to get Jane's sympathy. It wasn't my first rodeo. Jane had a good evening being the center of attention. Maybe I should have been more worried about her flirtatious manner, but we're talking about Jane. This is a woman who has done the right things. All her life has been a good daughter and wife. We took turns dancing with Jane. From time to time, I caught Jean-Paul trying to rub up against Jane, and whenever that happened, I intervened. It really pissed him off. When I finally told Jane it was time to leave, he tried to tease me with a snide comment. I would have left him there, but he came out with us, and I decided to take him home. When I stopped in front of his apartment, he tried to tease me again by kissing Jane. I'm sure she thought it was going to be one of those cheek kisses, but he kissed her on the lips, catching Jane off guard. I was glad she didn't return the kiss. We made love that night, but we used those damn condoms. I missed feeling her. I decided to avoid this jerk for the rest of the weekend. I hinted that I didn't like this guy, that he was rude and disrespectful. Jane didn't argue, and I thought I'd made my point. When it came time to board the plane, I tried my best to tell Jane that I loved her and to be careful. During the first week, we talked on the phone almost every evening. She called me on Saturday afternoon and informed me that the staff was spending the evening at dinner and promised to call me on Sunday. When we finally connected on Sunday evening, Jane looked distant. She claimed that she was just tired from a long week because she had been working for the first 6 days. Over the next 2 weeks, the calls became less and less frequent. By the end of the third week, I got worried and planned to fly in next weekend. We had a good long conversation on Thursday. I told Jane about my plans to fly in on Friday and stay until Sunday, but I didn't tell her that my flight home was actually on Tuesday, and it was her birthday on Monday, and I wanted to surprise her. Jane greeted me at the airport with kisses and hugs. She said I was in for a pleasant surprise. She's booked a bungalow in Phillipsburg. She said she was tired of living on the French side and wanted a change of scenery. It seemed strange, but I was determined to use this weekend to rebuild my relationship with my wife, and my whining about her plans would not help me start the weekend, right? The first hint of trouble came when Jane undressed that night. The light was weak, but I didn't see any tan lines. That night we made love, of course, with condoms, but it was too dark to know for sure. I did the smart thing. I didn't sleep until she fell asleep, and I used the flashlight on my phone. Damn, there's no trace, not even a thong. The next morning, the weekend went downhill. When I asked Jane about the lack of tan lines, she became defensive and came up with some story about being able to sunbathe in privacy on their terrace, adding, "You don't trust me." I was already starting to distrust, but I kept it to myself. It is difficult to determine the right approach in this situation. In retrospect, I should have grabbed Jane and brought her home. If she had cheated, maybe I would have forgiven her, and we could have solved the problem with counseling. Some couples can survive a husband or wife cheating, but it takes two to save a marriage, and at this stage, I'd be working alone. On Saturday and Sunday, we went about our business until I faked my departure from the island on Sunday afternoon. Initially, I intended to catch Jane at her apartment on Monday morning and spend as much time with her as her work schedule would allow. At least I assumed that we would have breakfast and dinner together now. After such a lousy weekend, I've reconsidered my plans. We said goodbye at the Hotel Jane to return to her apartment, and Margot had to go to the airport. The depth of our relationship is evidenced by the fact that Jane did not argue when I suggested that she not accompany me to the airport. She was probably in a hurry because she didn't notice that I asked my taxi to turn around at the first roundabout and follow her taxi. She drove straight to the apartment where we met Jean-Paul. That first evening, more than a month ago. She didn't even knock on the door but walked right in. I paid the driver and thought about what I should do. It took only 2 minutes to decide to meet them, but I hoped I wasn't too late yet. I was about to knock on the door when I heard the words that destroyed all hope. They probably wouldn't have heard my knock, given the banging on the door and Jane's screams. I left and went to the airport, missing the Sunday flight, but managed to change my ticket from Tuesday to Monday. I checked into the room and got drunk. I don't think I slept more than 2 hours. I can't say why, but for some reason I got out of bed early on Monday morning. I bought a bouquet of flowers and took a taxi to Jane's apartment. I gave $20 to a young man to take flowers and a postcard I bought earlier to her door when he knocked. I was watching him from across the street. Allison opened the door, took the postcard, disappeared into the apartment, then handed the postcard back to the young man. He came back to me with flowers and a postcard. The lady said that your wife no longer lives there. Wrote a new address on the postcard. Sorry. He handed me a postcard and I saw Jean-Paul's address written on it. Do you want to get another 20? We can walk a quarter of a mile and get them there. Of course, we walked without saying a word. I think the young man was embarrassed for me, a married cuckold. He knocked on Jean-Paul's door. I stayed in the park opposite, but I saw a young man pass a postcard and flowers through the open door. When the young man returned, he only said, "I don't think she's yours anymore. I'm sorry." Neither of them even bothered to put anything on before opening the door. I gave him the 20, and before we could leave, the apartment door opened. Jean-Paul came out still naked and threw flowers over the railing. That same day, I flew home and began to unravel our married life. On the advice of a divorce lawyer, I documented the balances in our accounts, divided the funds, and opened my own accounts, deleting my name from our shared credit card and checking account. My goal was to get everything ready before I informed Jane of our divorce. If Jane noticed the lack of love and warmth during subsequent infrequent phone calls, she didn't say anything until the 3rd week. For some reason, Jane decided to come home, but she didn't tell me why on the phone. "Richard, you don't seem too happy about my return. What happened?" "Jane, you've been gone for almost 8 weeks. The separation turned out to be more difficult than I expected." "You'll see. Everything will change when you get off the plane. Let's wait until Saturday and then we'll talk." Jane seemed displeased with my indifference. Was she really that delusional? I had no plans to meet Jane's flight home. I had no desire to look at her anymore, listen to her excuses, or ask her for reasons. Besides, what if her reasons for why? Get in your head. My heart was made of stone, and I had another difficult task ahead of me. On Friday evening, I went to Rosa and Paul's house. They welcomed me as their son, as they always have. Richard, what a pleasant surprise. We didn't expect to see you until Sunday. We are looking forward to meeting Jane and having Sunday dinner together. Rose, Paul, I'm really sorry to tell you this. Jane has a lover in St. Martin, as far as I can tell. She was seeing him most of the time. She was away. This can't be happening. It's not our Jane. There must be some mistake. There is no mistake. I was convinced of this the last time I was there. She moved out of her apartment and lives with a Frenchman she met there. Rose started crying. The floor looked like it was going to explode. I still don't believe in it. It's some kind of mistake. Well, you can ask her when she arrives tomorrow. You'll have to meet her flight. I'm done with her. There are divorce papers in this envelope. She can ask her lawyer to contact mine. His business card is inside. If she insists, I can send her an official notification. But I don't see the need for that. Everything we own is divided in half. The lease of our apartment expires in 6 weeks, and the rent is paid in advance. This will give her time to extend the contract or take out her property. I threw the envelope on the sofa, turned around, and left. Of course, the next day there were calls and text messages. Jane left messages begging me to talk to her. I replied to messages only with my own. Go to my lawyer. It's over with us, Jane Davis. The first time I saw Jean Paul running towards us on the beach, something happened to me. How else to explain all the stupid things that I did from that moment until the moment I got off the plane at Kennedy Airport? Richard was the man I planned to love all my life, with whom I hoped to start a family who treated me with love and respect. I repaid him with cruelty and disrespect. It all started from the moment Richard and I stopped at the beach that first day. Jean-Paul was handsome with the body of a Greek god, only darker. He was charming, but I didn't notice that his charm was directed exclusively at me, and I also didn't recognize his light jokes about Richard. I foolishly blurted out that Richard and I were planning to spend the afternoon on the nudist part of the beach. Therefore, it is not surprising that Jean-Paul appeared that day, and I was pleased to think that I had attracted the attention of such a handsome man. He made sure I was watching him when he got up to take off his shorts. Jean-Paul smiled at me as he sat down on the chaise longue to my left and continued to dominate the conversation. And I let him. I've always been a good girl at school and college. I took my studies and football seriously, rarely attended parties, and the few parties I attended were the ones my parents would approve of if they saw me. I was a virgin until my sophomore year of college, losing my virginity to a guy I dated for almost the entire year. I was heartbroken when we broke up. It wasn't until my senior year that the second guy dragged me into his bed. We only lasted a few months before I realized that I didn't love him. I would never love him and would only hurt him by delaying the inevitable. It was 6 months after graduation when Richard came into my life. I was so happy when he continued our chaste shipboard romance. The expression shipboard romance is casual or ephemeral, as if taking place on board a ship. By knocking on my parents' door, both my parents fell in love with Richard. Dad always referred to him as his son. Richard was the perfect gentleman when we were dating, never pressured me in terms of bed, allowing me to take my time to realize that he was my future partner before we made love for the first time. And it was love. I will never forget his look when he loomed over me and entered me. That look said, "I love you." The following week, Richard proposed to me, of course, with my father's permission. It was a short engagement, a wonderful wedding, and a honeymoon, just like in a Hallmark movie, until Richard took off his swimming trunks and I took off my top on a public beach. Our marriage was just as wonderful, and we were months away from starting a family when I messed it up. The reasons why I volunteered to help build the clinic were mostly altruistic, but not entirely. 2 middle-aged nurses at work poured poison into my head, telling me how I missed out on a lot because I was a good girl and didn't experience all the joys of life before settling down. How could you get married so early? Have you ever wondered what it would be like to make love to a real stud? These 2 snakes filled my head with doubts, and I was too stupid to realize that they were single, divorced, and jealous of my happiness. So I took the opportunity to take a few months away from my life to make sure that pregnancy at 28 was really what I wanted. Jean-Paul invited us to have dinner with him in the city as a thank you for allowing him to spend the afternoon with us. Richard didn't want to agree, but I agreed without consulting him at that moment. Richard would have looked stupid if he had refused. We picked up Jean-Paul at his apartment, had dinner in the city, and walked through the block to the dance club. It was almost a competition to see who would turn me on the most. It was almost midnight when Richard finally said it was time to return to our room. Jean-Paul made a comment about Richard being a loser at the party. Richard replied, "No, it's just time for me to be alone with my wife so that we can end the evening the way a happy married couple should." I think it made Jean-Paul angry. He seemed to take it as a challenge when he got out of the car at his house. He kissed me on the lips. Jean-Paul tried to use his tongue. Fortunately, I kept my lips closed. I think the only reason Richard and I didn't fight that night was because Richard saw that I didn't return the kiss. The next morning, Saturday, Richard told me that we would not go to the beach, and we went to the Dutch side of the island and had a good lunch. That night, we stayed at home and made love. Richard was leaving on Sunday, and it was nice to spend the last night in his arms before we parted. On Sunday, I kissed Richard goodbye when he drove me to Allison's apartment. His last words before getting into the rental car were, "Remember how much I love you, how much I will miss you. Be careful, my love." In the first week, Jean-Paul showed up at work to say hello and invite me to lunch. We had lunch together, and he dispelled my suspicions by behaving like an impeccable gentleman. When Allison warned me that day to be careful around Jean-Paul, I brushed off her concerns as well. "Just be careful around Jean-Paul. Don't forget that you're married to a wonderful man." That was probably the worst thing she could have said at that moment in my life. On the first Saturday, the entire staff went to dinner. Jean-Paul must have become friends with one of my colleagues because he showed up and sat down at our table, charming everyone except Allison. Jean-Paul persuaded me to return to the same dance club where Richard and I spent the evening. Jean-Paul danced with me for the next 2 hours, practically making love on the dance floor, taking breaks only to have another drink at our table. He took liberties with me, which I never allowed Richard to do in public, and he took me to his apartment and used me. There is no other way to describe it. Jean-Paul used my body, and my body responded to him that night. I never had time to think about my betrayal. Every time my conscience began to torment me, Jean-Paul read my thoughts. After the first time we made love, we laid together, I in his arms, just when I was about to say I have to go. He turned me over on my stomach and took me from behind. "Born beautiful. You're awake." We finished and took a shower together, not stopping, playing with each other until the warm water ran out. Jean-Paul made coffee and sliced a baguette for breakfast. He lent me a toothbrush. I wasn't surprised to see that he had a supply of cheap toothbrushes in his drawer. When he saw my expression, he just gave me his wicked smile. "Hurry up. We're going to the beach. I'm going to have to stop by and grab a swimsuit." How am I going to explain last night to Allison? "You don't have to. You're not going home. Do you have a bikini collection in another drawer? No. But you can wear one of my t-shirts until we get to the beach. You won't need a swimsuit on a nude beach." But I never go without underwear, even if it's a thong. Today, everything will change. We actually went to a nudist beach, though not on Orient. We went to Kopi Koi, the beach that Richard and I had already visited once. Jean-Paul seemed to take pleasure in making me feel uncomfortable by pushing the boundaries. It was the first time I refused him. He was unhappy, but resigned. I let him put sunscreen on me, and it was almost a mistake. I felt like I was getting wet again. "Let's get back to you." We did so and made love 2 more times before. Jean-Paul brought me to my apartment in the evening, and again, Allison said something wrong. "I thought I told you to be careful with this man. He's going to ruin your life and ruin your marriage." I didn't need a moral lesson. I didn't say a word. I just went into my bedroom and closed the door. For the next 2 weeks, I was rushing back and forth between my apartment and Jean-Paul's apartment. And all this time, Allison was cold to me at work. Finally, on Thursday, I had had enough. Jean-Paul asked me to move in with him earlier that week, and so far I've been hesitant. "Allison, Glenna is looking for a place to live. Why don't I move out and give her my room? Do you mind?" Allison breathed a sigh of relief. "That's fine with me. When?" "Tomorrow." I spent the evening packing my things and talking to Richard on the phone. His voice sounded lonely, and it was a difficult phone conversation. I couldn't tell if he suspected anything, but I tried to calm him down. We even agreed that he would come to us for another long weekend. Richard will check the flights and contact me. Now I had to figure out how to keep Richard away from Margot, my job, and Allison. The weekend Richard came to was a disaster. Richard tried too hard, and I didn't try at all. As a result, I began to feel sorry for him, which led to my disrespect for him. I was almost relieved when Richard suggested that I not go to the airport to say goodbye. My stomach was churning all weekend as I tried to hide the betrayal of our marriage. I hailed a taxi and went straight to the apartment I now shared with Jean-Paul. When I entered the apartment, Jean-Paul was already waiting for me. We only made love 3 times. Okay, this fool belongs to me that weekend. The way I treated Richard, the way I disrespected him, denying him full control of my mind and body. All because Jean-Paul demanded it led to the complete destruction of any self-respect I still had. Sunday night was the first time I let Jean-Paul, or any other man for that matter, play with my ass. On Monday morning, a postcard and flowers arrived from Richard. At first I panicked, thinking that Richard knew that I was living with Jean-Paul, but on the envelope I found Allison's handwriting, which forwarded the postcard from my old apartment to the new one. Jean-Paul defiantly threw the flowers outside and then laughed after reading Richard's romantic birthday card before throwing it in the trash. Wait, you'll see what I bought you for your birthday. There is nothing more useless than a bouquet of flowers. On Saturday evening, we went to a club. Jean-Paul was constantly buying drinks. We were dancing. At some point, his friend appeared and joined us. Simon was a thin Frenchman who worked in the planning department. I had already met him once when I had lunch with Jean-Paul. Simon asked me to dance. Come on, have fun," Jean-Paul replied when I looked at him. Simon and I were dancing the first dance when the second song started. Jean-Paul joined us on the dance floor. They held me between them, danced dirty, talked, rubbed against me. Finally, one of the bouncers came over to separate us. We must have been acting very risky because I saw terribly obscene behavior on this dance floor. Jean-Paul got angry when the bouncer told us to cool off. Let's get out of here. When we walked back to the apartment, Simon was still hanging around. He took a joint out of his pocket, lit it, and passed it around. I took a little puff. It was the first time for me. As the joint was passed from one to the other, my head was spinning more and more with each small puff. By the time we got to our apartment, the joint was finished. Jean-Paul poured us tequila glasses as soon as we walked through the door. Jean-Paul and I were sitting on the couch. Simon was sitting at the kitchen table. Simon pulled away without saying a word. Jean-Paul continued to kiss me until he lifted me from his lap. Jean-Paul directed me to the bed, turn around and sit on it. I didn't understand at first. When I hesitated, Jean-Paul grabbed my arms and pushed me back onto the bed. Jean-Paul didn't give me time to get used to this intrusion. He pressed down on my shoulders so that my back was on Simon's chest. Then he came down on top of me. Nothing prepared me for how long they would use me. I was exhausted and lying between them. I think I cried when I passed out from drinking. When I woke up on Sunday morning, Simon was gone. Jean-Paul made coffee and brought me a cup. It's very rare for him to serve me in bed. It was fun last night. Have some coffee. We're going to the beach on the Tuesday of the 3rd week after Richard's visit. I felt strange in the morning and realized that I had missed my period a few weeks ago. I snuck into the clinic's lab while the technician was at lunch and took a test on my own, which confirmed that I was pregnant. But how? At the time of conception, Richard was using condoms and Jean-Paul was protected. Condoms can break. But then, a terrible thought occurred to me. On Wednesday, I became convinced that Jean-Paul was using me before I left for work. I put a sample of his fluid under the microscope as soon as I arrived at the clinic. Jean-Paul's little swimmers swam in the sample. This fool was lying. He was fertile and most likely the father of my child. I ran down the street to his office and bumped into him. "I'm pregnant." "So what? It's yours. You haven't been operated on. I've checked, and you're fertile. So what? Get rid of it. Or better yet, take him and let Richard raise him. I can't ask Richard to raise your child. Don't you take care of me and our baby," shouting these words. I lashed out at Jean-Paul, punching his chest with my fists. Jean-Paul responded by slapping me hard across the face, hard enough to throw me back into a chair. "You stupid American fool! Did you really think that I cared about you? It gave me pleasure to make a cuckold out of your handsome sailor husband. Now you can go back to America and he can raise my child like a real cuckold. Get your shit out of my apartment and leave me alone. The slap in his words were like a cold shower. Suddenly, everything became clear. My life had turned into a cesspool of immorality. The blinders fell off my eyes, and I saw what I had become. Am I too late to save my happy life at home? I reached the apartment and packed my things at the clinic. I asked Joan if I could stay with her for a few days. I informed him that I was going home. Rumors about this spread within a few hours. Allison came up to me. Well, did he corrupt you? What did he sell you to? One of the city officials. I warned you to stay away from him. He uses women as bribes to get preferences for his projects. Why didn't you tell me about it? I warned you, but you didn't want to listen. You were too caught up in your dirty affair to listen. Now you're just a cheap cheater. Good luck getting Richard back. I'm sure he knows what you've been doing here. But Richard loves me. I flew home on Saturday wishing, hoping, and praying that Richard would forgive me so that we could rebuild our lives and love together. I was sure I could get him back. He really loved me. Richard. About 3 weeks after Jane returned home, her mother and father visited me. It was a gloomy meeting. Rosa and Paul were surprised by my lack of emotions until I stopped holding them back. It was right after Rose asked me, "Can't you two do something to stay together? You are so good for each other." I started to choke but managed to utter these words. That's what I thought too, that we were right for each other. But I heard them making love. Less than half an hour after we parted at the hotel, she practically ran into his apartment, and when I went to the door to meet them face to face, I heard them. I couldn't have been mistaken in what I heard, and I'm not going to live with a woman who can do this to a man she supposedly loves. I'm so sorry. After this meeting, the calls and messages from Jane stopped. The documents were signed. 3 months later, our marriage became history. I didn't turn into a zombie and drink myself into oblivion every night. It helped that I had friends and relatives I could talk to. They mostly listened with some of them. I talked about my desire to somehow make John Paul pay for seducing my wife. It seemed unfair to me that he could get away with anything. Several of my friends took my revenge fantasies with interest, offering their ideas, but I don't think they took me seriously. My brother realized that this was not just a fantasy and warned me not to do anything that could lead me to a Caribbean prison. Despite the fact that my brother advised me to give up revenge for the memories of the dark smile on Jean-Paul's face will not disappear until I do something. It took planning, but after 2 months I was ready to implement my plan. In these 2 months I have radically changed my appearance. Gone were the business haircut and the clean-shaven face. Now I wore a thick beard, and on the day of departure I shaved my head. I took a page from actor De Niro's textbook and gained 35.15 pounds, 87 kilograms. Having changed my sunglasses from round ones to aviators, I was completely transformed. I took a train to Miami and took a boat to Puerto Rico. So far, everything was fine. I was in the Caribbean without any official records of my stay here. Now, the most difficult thing is to rent a sailboat without a credit card. That's where an old friend and a lot of cash came in handy. I had a backup plan, but I kept my fingers crossed that I wouldn't need it. Tony, Alberto, and I served together on the USS Shiloh and have been in touch since he returned to his hometown near San Juan. When I knocked on his door, it took him half a minute to recognize me. 10 minutes later, we were finishing our first beer, and Tony understood why I had come. "You're not going to kill him, are you? I'm not going to be an accessory to murder, even if that asshole deserves it." I showed Tony the tools of my revenge, and it made him grin. "Well, I can agree to that. So do you need a boat big enough to take you to St. Martin? But small enough, not to attract too much attention to yourself? We'll talk to Hector at the pier tomorrow." Hector was more than willing to lend us one of the sailboats in his care. As soon as I showed him the $3,000 bills, Tony and I set sail early on Tuesday morning, just before the fishing boat set sail. Sailed all day, and by 2 o'clock in the morning, anchored off Crankcase Bay. At 4 in the morning, I slipped into the water and swam to shore. After reaching the shore, I jogged 3.5 miles to the park opposite John Paul's apartment and sat down on the same bench where I sat a few months ago when I watched my wife enter this apartment. I decided to take a chance, waiting and watching, hoping that he was a creature of habit. A young woman left the apartment at 8 in the morning, and Jean-Paul left at 8:30. I followed him at a safe distance. He entered the building. I checked the sign on the door. It was his office. I jogged back to the Grand Case, swam to our boat. Tony weighed anchor, and we spent the day sailing around 10. Tomorrow Island. In the evening, we went to Friars Bay. Tony didn't even lower the anchor. I went overboard with my tools in a waterproof case, and Tony swam out of the bay at 7:20 in the morning. I returned to the park, and 35 minutes later, the same woman came out of the apartment. I waited 10 minutes, crossed the street, and knocked on his door. Jean-Paul opened the door with a towel wrapped around his waist. I didn't give him time to say anything before I tasered him. Of course, he didn't have time to recognize me. That was one of the problems. As much as I wanted Jean-Paul to find out who did this to him, I didn't want to go to jail. Maybe someday, after the statute of limitations expires. I'll let him know if it still matters by then. I closed the door behind me while Jean-Paul was in custody. I tied him to a chair, forced him to drink a bottle of water with a sedative, gagged him, and attached the device. Did I mention that I spent 3 summers working at my uncle's ranch during high school? One of the most unpleasant jobs, at least for me, was the annual castration of bulls and horses. One of the ranch hands showed me how to use a good old bandera to castrate cattle. You tie it around your scrotum. Leave it for a few hours and voila, a useless set of shriveled eggs with any luck. It'll be hours before anyone finds this bastard. By then, the damage will be done definitively. I jogged back to Friars Bay, swam to the boat, and late on Thursday evening, Tony and I sailed back to Fardeau Harbor. By Saturday morning, I was home-shaved and ready to go on a diet. As for Jane's revenge, that's not going to happen for several reasons. First of all, I know that she is suffering. Her parents had lost their son, and she would have to live with the knowledge that it was her fault. Secondly, I know that there is someone else for me, and living well is the best revenge, and someday she'll understand what she's given up on, our future, our children, and yes, the love we shared for the first 6 years together. And finally, not letting her apologize was probably the most disgusting thing I could have done. That's my revenge, if I'm honest with myself. Jane, I moved in with my parents and started working at the hospital next to their house while my stomach was growing. My parents forced me to go to a therapist saying that this was a prerequisite, if they would allow me to move in with them and help take care of the child. It took no more than 6 sessions with a therapist to analyze where everything went wrong. 2 harpies from my old clinic set the stage for this. I was immature, allowing their ridicule to fuel my narcissism, believing that I deserved and should get more out of life. I was afraid that I would become a mother and be tied hand and foot. Finally, I was ready to fall in love with a charming seducer who offered something forbidden. Therapy explained to me why I did it, helped me understand what I could do in the future if I ever got another chance at love. But it didn't give me what I wanted more than anything in the world, another chance with Richard. Martin was born on September 6th, exactly 1 year after Irma destroyed St. Martin. The epilogue, Jane Martin turned 7 years old, and Mom, Dad, and I went with him to the Philadelphia Zoo. We were having a snack at Tiger Terrace when I saw him. Richard was walking past a large cat waterfall with a woman and 2 children. The eldest of them, probably a 4-year-old girl, was walking in the youngest. Perhaps a 2-year-old boy was sitting on Richard's shoulders and laughing. This woman couldn't be any different from me. 5'3", 160 centimeters, curvaceous with brown hair and dark eyes. They were in their own little world and didn't notice us when they passed by. I looked at my parents. Mom and Dad were watching them go. Mom looked sad, but it was Dad who shocked me. In my 35 years, I had never seen my father shed a single tear until that day. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed listening, please like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Also, leave a comment below to share your thoughts on what happened.